University of Kansas. I'm pleased to welcome you to this one-day colloquium on Bobrisky, Agency, Subjectivity, Politics. Before anything else, I would like to put on record our profound gratitude to Professor Glenn Adams, Director of the Kansas African Studies Center, and Professor Omalade Adumbi, Director of the University of Michigan African Studies Center, not only for co-sponsoring today's event, but for going the extra mile by agreeing to moderate the two panels comprising today's colloquium. We truly appreciate their intellectual leadership, collegiality, and support for our work, and we look forward to more collaborations in the foreseeable future. We also wish to express our gratitude to all our colleagues who took provocation from our synopsis and agreed to share aspects of their research with us today. We're gathered here this morning, albeit virtually, to discuss Nigeria's most visible transgender person and social media personality, Okuneye Idris Olariwaju, popularly known as Bobrisky. Right from the moment Bobrisky emerged as a socio-cultural and social media phenomenon in Nigeria, Dr. Yoko and I have been intrigued, first by the emergence itself, and second by the Nigerian public's reaction. Over the years, as Bobrisky has gone through numerous transitions, ostensibly from one gender to another, from a dark-skinned to a light-skinned person and back, and from humble beginnings to a legitimate member of the Lagos elite and a social influencer in their own right, we have had numerous conversations about the meanings of these multiple and concurrent transitions and what they indicate about the social backdrop against which they have unfolded. At the same time, we have been fascinated by the reaction to Bobrisky's appearance on the social scene, a mix of amazement, alarm, discombobulation, double take, outright aversion, not to mention a certain shrug of the collective, not to mention a certain shrug of the shoulders. The indifference, if not the aversion, mounting the more Bobrisky became a fixture on the social calendar, whether showing dance moves before Part 1, that's Queen Gwashia Ayinde Marshall, on one day, or snagging an award as the best dressed female the next. How is the scholar to take the measure of all this? Dr. Yoko and I come from two different but complementary disciplinary perspectives. He is a scholar of social media and self-fashioning, author of, among other important works, a well-received book on cultural netizenship, social media, popular culture, and performance in Nigeria. And for some years now, teacher of a course on Black masculinities at the University of Kansas. For my part, I come to Bobrisky from a decades-long interest in the sexual dimension of citizenship, not least the role that religiosity plays in how sexualized agents, practices, not to mention gender roles, are framed. My most recent book, Pastoral Power, Clerical State, Pentecostalism, Gender and Sexuality in Nigeria, an analysis of the social origins of clerical authority in the country, is also in part an examination of the emergence of the figure of the pastor as an erotic subject and the sexualized nature of the interaction between predominantly male pastors and their female congregants. In short, Dr. Yoko and I take sex, sexualities, and sexualization seriously. So seriously, in fact, that we accept the essential truth of Oscar Wilde's famous epigram that, quote, everything in the world is about sex, except sex. Sex is about power, unquote. Now, if Wilde, who even when he's wrong, can always be counted upon to be insightful, if he's right, the question for us becomes what insights and perspectives can be gleaned about the dynamic interaction of sex and power, and sex as power, using Bobrisky, the person and the phenomenon, as our primary perceptual lens. In order to get a proper handle on this all-important question, we begin where we believe inquiries of this sort must begin, which is with the question of the individual. Why we're interested in how the Bobrisky phenomenon can be used to illuminate the central paradoxes of identity, being, citizenship, community, and subjectivity in contemporary Nigeria, we are under no illusion that this can be done without first attending to the question of Bobrisky as an individual, and the tensions and contradictions that then ensue on the allowances and limits of self-fashioning and self-authorship, the age-old tension between the individual and the community, and what or what not the individual owes to that society, and vice versa, all against the backdrop of a rapidly evolving digital milieu. Seen through this lens, the issues raised by Bobrisky are too important to be left either to Bobrisky or, by parity of reasoning, to LGBT transgender, or queer-identifying individuals or communities in Nigeria alone. On the contrary, and to paraphrase the late Ikemba Ofunewi Chief Emeka Odumegwu, in matters of sex, sexuality, gender, and individual rights, all of which collect under the sign of the transgender phenomenon, were all involved. The amount of attention and interest generated by this colloquium and the number of people registered and have decided to join us today is one recognition of the validity of this intuition. If then Bobrisky can and should not be left to Bobrisky alone, it behooves us as scholars and students of the Nigerian society to, with all the moral seriousness at our disposal, pose, evaluate, and pursue the various issues and problems suggested, with the ultimate aim of understanding the varieties of ways in which radically different individuals in a free society authorize, or take full possession of their lives. One such issue, to take perhaps the lowest hanging fruit, is disgust, one emotion among others that is invariably aroused by any mention of Bobrisky. But what does it mean that a cross-section of the Nigerian society reacted and continues to react to Bobrisky with disgust? What are the cultural triggers of this disgust? How should the Nigerian society handle disgusting acts, practices, signals, or crucially, members? Excuse me. What moral tremors are awakened by disgust? And what questions does it raise about the humanity of the apparently disgusting? Insofar as disgust is a reaction to potential contamination, what precisely is Bobrisky and ipso facto individuals like Bobrisky believed to be at a risk of contaminating in Nigeria? And how does this alert us to the connection between gender, sex, and social contagion? Wherever you find disgust, it is right to assume that fear is not too far away. But fear of what precisely? With respect to Bobrisky, is it the possibility of the status quo, especially in regard to sexual norms, social power, and influence being suddenly overturned? If so, how does this help our attempt to understand the relation between sex, gender, and social hierarchy? Taking Bobrisky as a point of departure also allows us to raise other questions as well. For instance, what it means to be a minority, as Bobrisky as a transgender person in Nigeria incontestably is. Given that not all minorities are the same, what determines how a particular society treats different minorities? How does the same society make room for minorities, and on what basis? What kind of minorities are admissible and based on what criteria? How do different minorities with different degrees and pedigrees of access to power and resources construct solidarities and alliances? Finally, by what social logics and technologies are minority practices and agents admitted into the mainstream? Not only are these questions far from exhaustive, as you will learn presently from the keynote lecture and presentations across the two panels, personal attitudes and disciplinary approaches to them vary. To this end, to help us set the intellectual tone with the keynote speech this morning is none other than Professor Olufemi Taiwo, a political philosopher. Professor Taiwo, or Malam as we all like to call him, is currently Professor of Africana Studies at Cornell University. Before joining the faculty at Cornell, he was Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Global African Studies Program at Seattle University in Washington. His book, How Colonialism Preempted Modernity in Africa, published by Indiana University Press in 2010, was a joint winner of the Frantz Fanon Book Award of the Caribbean Philosophical Association in 2015. Professor Taiwo's most recent work is Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously. Published in 2022, Against Decolonization is, to my mind, one of the most important works to have appeared in the entire field of African studies in recent decades. And if you haven't read it, I have only one question for you. What are you waiting for? Over the years, I've known and interacted with Professor Taiwo as one of his many mentees, and lately, to my good fortune, his friend. From this proximity, I've seen firsthand not only the centrality of the idea of the individual to his thought, but also the extent to which he will go in its defense as the inalienable cornerstone of what it means to be human. Accordingly, the choice of Professor Taiwo as the person to give the keynote today was, as the saying goes, a no-brainer. Given the presence of the subject of this colloquium at the critical intersection of individuality, law, subjectivity, and enterprise, subjects on which he has written with passion and uncommon penetration, we could scarcely conceive of anyone more suited for the role, better suited for the role. We had a straightforward demand. We wanted Professor Taiwo to indicate what it has stake, philosophically, legally, and culturally speaking, in the Bobrisky phenomenon. What core cross-cutting ethical and civic principles does Bobrisky, the person and the phenomenon, alert us to in a Nigerian and possibly African context? And what questions and complications about what it is to be human are brought to the fore by Bobrisky's emergence, visibility, and disputed influence? We couldn't be more thrilled that he accepted our invitation this morning, and he will be speaking on the subject of Africa's second struggle for freedom, the legal subject revisited. Allow me to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Olufemi Taiwo. So over to you, Malam.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you all very much, and thank you very much, Ebino, as we fondly call you. So don't let me take any more time. Let me just go ahead with I would like to start this address by saluting the people of Botswana for validating those of us who continue to insist on the unicity of humanity and the possibilities of intercultural understanding, especially of domesticating and indigenizing what is borrowed, stolen, or imposed from elsewhere in this speciesdom that we call humanity. 2 days ago, Botswana gave a stinging rebuke to Africa's band of scholar frauds who live in the belly of the proverbial beast, insist on the meticulous recognition by their governments of the privileges attached thereto, but go across Africa telling the people there that liberal democracy is a hoax and they should rather recover their quote-unquote ancestral quote-unquote monarchical democracies for the 21st century and beyond. And they are ably supported by an ex-general and ex-president who embodies the ultimate in lack of self-awareness, issuing his admonitions from the comfort of a quote-unquote presidential library that, we have asked him in the past, is not part of this ancestral inheritance that he and his ilk wish to use to keep Africa from going forward. Hail Botswana, whose people just tossed out in an election a government formed by a party that led them to independence and has governed the country for 58 years. Just as happened to the conservatives in Britain recently, the Botswana Democratic Party was wiped out in this election. Either Botswanans really love their colonial hand-me-down, or they are a discerning people who have recognized that this system can deliver for them in exactly the way it has delivered and continues to deliver for other peoples who are not even remotely, quote-unquote, Western. While we're on the theme of the relevance of liberal democracy in Africa, a good part of my presentation here today, it is not too late to salute and celebrate the people of Senegal, who, in their own version of embracing the liberal legacy in their country, in May this year, and for the third time in their post-independence history, did not allow a scheming third-termer to junk their constitution and illegally elongate his tenure in the presidency of the country. It is left to our quote-unquote ancestralists to show that Botswana and Senegal are fake African countries, or that their respective citizens continue to suffer from a terminal case of colonial mentality. I take this opportunity to thank my regular interlocutor and teacher, Dr. Ebenezer Badare, and Professor James Yeku for putting this timely confab together. I thank too all the institutions and those working behind the scenes to make this a reality, and you, our audience, for gracing us with your presence and attention. In this presentation, I revisit a theme I wrote about many years ago and place it within a wider context that was not present to my consciousness back then, but has become a core focus of my work in recent times. I argue that the tragedy of Bobrisky's unconscionable incarceration presents a significant reminder of all that is important, but which we continue to ignore in our continent when it comes to the imperative of freedom and the inviolate dignity of the littlest among us. No culture, only rights can trump rights. Notice I said Bobrisky's unconscionable incarceration. The reference is to her being sent to jail for abusing the national currency without the option of fine that was given to others before her and after her. My interest is not in all the other issues that have been litigated with him, including the most recent arrest in a plane bound for Europe at the airport in Lagos, or is it Abuja, or the preemption of his travel at the Nigeria-Benin border, last week or so, and so on. If Mr. Okuneye or Bobrisky commits a crime, the law should take its course, a standpoint mandated and informed by the same principles and commitments that undergird what I'm going to say here today. So to those who ask us, why Bobrisky? I answer, echoing my dear friend, colleague, and interlocutor, why not Bobrisky? But this comes with serious risks that I wish to lay out before you now. There are three ways in which we can understand making Bobrisky a focus of this scholarly discussion. Two are to be rejected, and I am embracing one. We should not forget that Bobrisky is a persona. As such, she is not real. But because this is not an episodic presentation, but a continuous self-presentation, to treat her as a quote-unquote cipher would be to do what we argue presently should not be done to a person. The second way is to treat her as an quote-unquote example. But given that quote-unquote making an example would be one way to describe her experience in the hands of the judge who handled her case, we should not be seen to be walking in that neighborhood. I have chosen instead to treat her as an quote-unquote exemplar, one who is representative of a group, the membership traits of which are reflected in her, and the treatment of whom enables us to ask questions about the legitimacy and rightness of such treatment by the state and by their fellow citizens, and that is the legal subject. And once we come to the idea of the legal subject, both Mr. Idris Okuneye and Bobrisky, given that both are embodied in the same person, evoke precisely the kind of attention to how they are treated as would the treatment of other exemplars of personhood that are supposed to merit certain forbearances for the simple reason that they are human persons. My initial foray into the idea of the legal subject was motivated by what I saw as the neglect in the literature, both in philosophy and jurisprudence across Africa, at least in English and French, of the phenomenon, even as it is obvious to those of us in the know, that the modern legal system is built entirely on the premise of protecting the legal subject from the predations of, especially the state, and those of the subject's fellow citizens in the context of social living. I was then interested in how this lack of interest in and discourse about the legal subject impacted the experiences of our citizens in their daily lives, and more specifically, in their interactions with the modern judiciary in our various countries. It was later that the idea of Africa's second struggle for freedom came to me, and this gathering has enabled me to bring these two ideas into face. How successful this is for you, my audience, to judge. Who is the legal subject and why is she central to modern law? Miranda rights have been in the news lately in the United States. Scholars of legal theory and practice are familiar with cases up to and including murder in which the accused have been let go on account of the violation of their Miranda rights by the arresting or the investigating police officer. Certainly, some of those cases rile people and offend their moral sensibility. Lawyers or political theorists or philosophers, on the other hand, often wring their hands and bow before the supremacy of process and hope that the courts will do a better job next time around. I have deliberately chosen this rather mundane principle because it typifies the triumph of procedure over outcome that is one of the hallmarks of the modern legal system. I should remark, by the way, that the right-wing hacks that now control the US Supreme Court have actually now made it legal in some way for the police not to read Miranda rights to accused persons in this country. That is how this country is sliding away from the founding principles of modern jurisprudence. There are even worse situations than that. You can now tender, the police can now tender evidence illegally obtained, which used to be precluded and not shared with the jury, in the past. No thanks to these right-wing hacks in the Supreme Court. It is customary for radical critics of liberal democracy and its twin doctrine of the rule of law to dismiss both as a sham, but only if we grant that they are sometimes genuine and serve on occasion to restrain the excesses of the modern state, such as are being exemplified by the Patriot Acts in the United States, e.g. detention without trial. Can we lament their prospective laws under conditions created by the aftermath of the attacks of September 11, 2001. I insist that the reason that we lament their laws and resist stoutly any despotic inroads into them is because we are confronted with the dismal prospects of living in a world shorn of the robust protections they offer against the rule of arbitrariness or caprice. And we are again on the cusp of another, junketeer playing with those if he wins on Tuesday. In law, the legal subject, possessor of reason, bearer of interest, author of actions, formally inferior to no other, is the object of solicitation. In the modern state, where the state enjoys the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence, the legal subject is protected from undue and unnecessary interference from the powers that be. In the modern state, it is the individual that needs and deserves protection from the state. It is not the state that needs and deserves protection from the individual. You can see how that basic principle is subverted in all countries where you do not have the modern state in place. Russia, China, North Korea, increasingly Venezuela, and all across Africa with a few exceptions, Senegal, Kenya, Nigeria until recently, but we're still struggling with it. South Africa, definitely. Botswana, that I have just talked about. Namibia, another place. So here is the basis of one of the most important principles of legal operation in the modern state. The doctrine of the presumption of innocence for the accused until she is proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. This doctrine is redolent with philosophical presuppositions that I cannot explore here. It holds sway in all areas of law. Although it is remarked upon more in criminal law and allied areas, it is no less required in tort. The defendant in tort does not have to prove that her action does not amount to a tortfeasance. The plaintiff is the one who has to prove that, but for the action or omission of the defendant, she would not have suffered injury. Again, we see, even in tort, the individual is protected. The freedom of the individual is absolute. Of course, I exaggerate a little, but I do so to underscore the point that I make later. The absoluteness of the freedom of the individual is best construed in a presumptive sense. It is like what we mean when we say that human beings are essentially free. We do not ask human beings to show why they should be free. We ask those who wish to curb human freedom to show why humans should not be free. By the same token, from the assertion that the freedom of the individual is absolute, it does not follow that this freedom may not be curbed. It merely means that anyone, including governments and their associates, seeking to curb it must discharge, underline discharge, the burden of proof that the interference is warranted and can be justified. I would like to submit that successive constitutions across our continent do not recognize this kind of freedom. They may be full of highfalutin pronouncements regarding the freedom of the individual. It's interesting how voluminous African constitutions are and how voluminous their bills of rights are. In reality, though, beyond the ritual, boring retelling by our intellectuals of the genealogy of human rights from the Magna Carta on, which narrative itself is inaccurate, there is no serious engagement on the part of our scholars in the main with the philosophical anthropology, which alone gives the relevant principles regarding the nature of the human person and the dignity that pertain to them, their pith. Additionally, many of those provisions are thwarted by, quote, clawback clauses, end quote, usually framed in terms of, quote, except where, ... fill in the blank spaces, usually spurious appeals to the security of the state, the ruler, dubious cultural values, and so on. You can begin to see how all these things all coalesce, in the Bobrisky situation. And the many ways in which what I just said now, shed some very significant light on what exactly is wrong with her being hounded by different constituencies, in Nigeria. Do Nigeria's constitutional framers mean to suggest, when they put those clauses, for instance, that a democratic society, so-called, may interfere with an individual's right to respect for his private and family home and correspondence, if such interference is, quote, in the interest of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, public health, or the economic well-being of the community? This is a sure sign that the framers of the Constitution not only did not take rights seriously, but there is room for doubt that they were aware of the many philosophical conundrums that their proposal might generate when they do so. In a sense, they seem to have adopted a crude utilitarian approach in which the rights of an individual may be battered away for the welfare of the many. I am not aware of much discussion among African scholars of the ethical and political philosophical problems posed by the proliferation of clawback clauses in African rights charters. Now, the legal subject is parasitic upon and a derivative of the subject in modern philosophy. And as I've argued in several places following Hegel and Habermas, the principle of the modern world is freedom of subjectivity. And that freedom of subjectivity is the right of the subject's particularity, its right to be satisfied, or in other words, the right of subjective freedom. That is the pivot and center of the difference between antiquity and modern times, according to Hegel. This right in its infinity is given expression in Christianity, and it has become the universal effective principle of a new form of civilization. And the Christianity that Hegel had in mind here, and this is relevant to Nigeria and other African countries, because when our people, come up with their homophobia, they usually say that if God had wanted, homosexuality to be in, he would have created Adam and Steve and not Adam and Eve. So they cherry pick, their Christianity to justify, the ugly homophobia that they want to promote. Whereas the Christianity that Hegel is talking about here is precisely Protestant Christianity, the one that Martin Luther told us, in which every believer is a priest to him or herself. So you begin to see, all these differences and variety that our people want to paper over, in the name of Christianity. Amongst the primary shapes which this right assumes are love, romanticism, and love is very important here because the principle that you do not force people into marriages, the principle that people should be free to marry whom they fall in love with, regardless of whatever boundaries, people may want to affirm, should upset that, is part of what we are talking about when we talk about this principle of subjectivity. romanticism, the quest for the eternal salvation of the individual. Next come moral convictions and conscience. And that is why the modern state does not legislate morality. And it does not claim to know what is right and then force everybody to good step, in accordance, with that specification. And finally, the other forms, some of which come into prominence in what follows as the principle of civil society and as moments in the constitution of the state, while others appear in the course of history, particularly the history of art, science, and philosophy. What Hegel celebrates as the triumph of subjectivity, the sociological concomitant of it is called individualism. And again, we know that in Africa, individualism is a red flag for many of our colleagues in the academy and beyond. So when we criminalize behavior that we do not approve of or make unbelievably high the transaction cost of particular lifestyles, to give you an example that many of us who live in Europe and North America will realize, the debate about taxing, alcohol and cigarettes rests on this. Because when we, put excessive taxes on those, we are practically making the cost of choosing that lifestyle prohibitively high for those who engage in them. So you always find states in all these places struggling with how much is too much, such that people will feel like you are now telling them you may not be a beer drinker, because just for you to get beer will be so involved in terms of the cost to you. And again, that's a lesson we need to learn, because in Africa, especially in Nigeria, where I come from, government just wakes up one morning and says, now we're going to be taxing sugar. And there's no debate, about why anybody should have to pay more for drinking sugary drinks. I'm not saying that there's something wrong with that. I am saying there are better ways in procedure of prosecuting that so that you get people's buy-in, because they understand, why that tax does not unduly burden their lives. We violate all the forbearances pertinent to the human individual, and in so doing, impair their inviolate dignity by compelling them to order their lives based on external preferences and renouncing their right to be the authors of their own life scripts. I'm not going to go into the full details of how this is manifested in law. A simple example should suffice. The presumption of innocence till an accused person is proven guilty in a properly constituted tribunal, the requirement of a search warrant before the state can step into the designated spaces of an individual or their bodily integrity, the insistence that no behavior be forbidden if it does not cause harm to others or interfere with their enjoyment of similar rights and privileges, all emanate from and are legitimately undergirded by the centrality of the principle of subjectivity in the modern state. I would now like to argue that when I speak of Africa's second struggle for freedom, it is precisely this solicitousness for the puny individual that is in play. Professor Yeku, please put the table on now. Please all take a look at the following table. So I have divided here what is the difference between, or the differences between, the first struggle for freedom, which I always call the struggle for independence, and the ongoing second struggle for freedom, which is post-independence. So if you look on the left column, the left column of the table, the first struggle was for groups, countries, polities, and all that, to be free from rule that they have not consented to and is imposed from outside. And that rule was motivated by exploitation, dominated by lack of interest in, much less allowing the colonized to choose how they wish to be ruled, and marked by overexploitation of natural resources without development. But then you have the second struggle, which began the day after independence. It was already going on, before independence, but everybody got together and independence was struggled for by those agglomerations. But the day after independence, one, freedom for groups within groups. So when people started raising questions about the so-called artificial boundaries, I don't know any country in the world with natural boundaries, that were imposed by colonialism, and then some groups saying we don't want to be part of this group anymore. You begin to see the kind of granularization, of life, at that level. But let's now take a group. Eritrea is a very good example that separated itself from Ethiopia, or South Sudan, another good example that separated itself. That struggle for second freedom, the second struggle for freedom, began to assert itself because South Sudanese and Eritreans should have individual autonomy along the lines that, I've been talking about. And the same will be true of Nigeria, of Ghana, so when Nkrumah imposed the Preventive Detention Act, he violated that for the people of Ghana post-independence. And then the struggle for the inviolate dignity of the individual, for the basic civil rights to freedom of expression, conscience, association, and privacy. And you see that definitely in Nigeria where, Christians get murdered in other parts of Nigeria. Until now, they are not, those who murder them are known. Sometimes they are arrested, but then they are freed and they are not prosecuted. Where you have Hisbah police in northern Nigeria that makes it illegitimate for you to engage in some businesses, that are not shown to be productive of harm to anybody except that they violate somebody else's, conscience preferences, and then the right to choose your rulers and have them be responsible and responsive to you. And the most important element of that, the most important sign of this freedom in this second part is what is called in liberalism, the right to be let alone. To conduct your life the way you wish, to make the choices that you wish to make, and to be free to be the author, the autonomy that we're talking about, of your own life script. And this is where Bobrisky becomes a very good exemplar, because here's a guy who started out as male, then decided for whatever reason, and that should not be our concern, to assume, a different persona. And notice the way I put it, to assume a different persona. And this is just as important that it be recognized as his choice and the autonomy to make that choice inviolate as it will be for somebody who is gay, not because they chose to be, but because that is who they are, from the get-go. And then we proceed to criminalize, to delegitimize, rubbish their lives because we happen not to like how they present themselves. So that's why I said the right to be let alone is the ultimate, the compact way of understanding all these other rights that I have just put in the second column. Thank you very much, Professor Yeku. The ultimate destination of a regime of rights and freedoms is the incorporation of a society in which individuals can lead lives marked by their own authorship of their respective life scripts, free to live as long as their freedom does not impair that of their fellows, and so on. We can see from this that freedom from colonialism for aggregated groups does not automatically translate into freedom for individuals from the unacceptable encumbrances of the state or their fellow citizens. The rights that have since become codified in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights have their origins in this modern historical movement, and I contend they are the objects of solicitation in modern African political philosophy. And this is very, very important. I argue that our African political philosophers, some of them very educated about their respective ancestral inheritances that our illiterate professors and ex-presidents will have us revert, notice the word, revert to, but decided that those inheritances may not be good enough for their time have never been absent from the political philosophical discourse of modernity and have indeed canvassed the adoption of modern governance in African countries. Here are two African philosophers who insisted that the struggle for independence was a lot more than a struggle for new flags, national anthems, and bureaucracies dominated by African exploiters. The first is Obafemi Awolowo. Obafemi Awolowo affirmed his unhesitating and unequivocal preference for Western democracy in the context of the then existing division of the world into ideological camps. I quote, "There are two distinct ideological camps in the world today, the Western democracies and the communist bloc. For reasons which I will presently give, my preference is unhesitatingly and unequivocally for the Western democracies," end of quote. Certainly, Awolowo did not care a bit about identity, nor did he evince any thought that his choice of what political system to follow was dictated by Nigeria's colonial rulers at the time he was writing. Even more instructive is that it was clear that there were many ways in which the appeal of quote-unquote Western democracies might be attenuated by the fact that, as he put it, in what should be a cautionary note to victims of identity-driven Occident anxiety at the present time, and I quote, "No nation in the world is absolutely good or absolutely evil. There is still a color bar in the Western democracies. Negroes in America are still being discriminated against and can still be lynched with impunity. For her part, Britain is still guilty, as before, though in a decreasing order of magnitude, of injustice to the black peoples in East and Central Africa. But such evils as are committed in the countries of the Western democracies towards the weaker peoples of the world are not only fast diminishing, but are being constantly subjected to strong and sharp criticism in those countries by their nationals without any risk to their lives or personal freedom. If you did likewise behind the Iron Curtain, you will not live to fight another day." Just place Awolowo right now in Nigeria with the jokers, asking for monarchical democracies, and then let us see, whether they will be willing to debate him. And of course, that's why I call them illiterate. They don't even know the man's work. They don't know his thinking. And they are shielding younger people from being curious about the intellectual legacy that is theirs to claim and explore for their own reasons. Contrary to what many would now like to believe, and in confirmation of our insistence on taking seriously the agency of African thinkers and ordinary people, as we find out presently, the fundamentals of modernity, especially when it comes to its philosophical anthropology and the unyielding commitment to the right of individuals to freedom and dignity, the latter pertaining to them for their sheer humanity no more, we see here an African thinker who was seen beyond the racist distortions of universal principles unearthed by modernity and owning those principles. In the next passage, Awolowo made clear what specifically those principles are and how they should inform life in what he would consider a superior mode of social living. And I quote, "As we planned for Nigeria's independence, we were fully conscious that freedom from British rule does not necessarily connote freedom for individual Nigerian citizens." So that's what I mean by the distinction between the first and the second struggles, for freedom. And Awolowo wrote this in 1960. I and most of my colleagues are Democrats by nature and socialists by conviction. We believe in the democratic way of life, equality under the law, respect for the fundamental rights of individual citizens, and the existence of independent and impartial tribunals where these rights could be enforced. We believe that the generality of the people should enjoy this life and do so in reasonable abundance. The most detestable feature of British administration was that the governed had no say in the appointment of those who governed them. A Nigerian administration by Nigerians must be erected on the general consent and the united goodwill of the majority of the people. In my view, there can be no satisfactory alternative to this. At the same time, and please pay attention everybody to this, I fully recognize that the healthy growth of a democratic way of life requires the existence of an enlightened community led by a group of people who are imbued with the all-consuming urge to defend, uphold, and protect the human dignity and the legal equality of their fellow men. End of quote. Awolowo contended that an enlightened community, should be led by people who are imbued with the all-consuming urge to defend human dignity. So let's go to the second thinker who was also a philosopher of freedom in Africa. At the very beginning of Africa Must Unite, Kwame Nkrumah proclaimed, freedom, Hetsole, Sawaba, Uhuru, all linguistic variations on the simple idea of freedom. He continued, and I quote, in this 20th century, there have already been 2 world wars fought on the slogans of the preservation of democracy, on the right of peoples to determine the form of government under which they want to live. Statesmen have broadcast the need to respect fundamental freedoms, the right of men to live free from the shadow of fears which cramp their dignity when they exist in servitude, in poverty, in degradation, and in contempt. Finally, in our struggle for freedom, parliamentary democracy was as vital an aim as independence. The two were inseparable. It was not our purpose to rid the country of the colonial regime in order to substitute an African tyranny. Ironically, he became part of that tyranny, later in his career. We wanted to free our people from arbitrary rule and to give them the freedom to choose the kind of government they felt would best serve their interests and enhance their welfare. End of quote. A life of freedom that is not marked by what Awolowo called the all-consuming urge to defend, uphold, and protect the human dignity of our fellow humans is an empty shell of a life. The object of concern here is the individual human. That is, freedom belongs to human beings, qua human beings. One way in which freedom is manifested is through the capacity of humans to express themselves in the world, that is, act in and on the world, in large part to attain their desires and interests. Autonomy of action refers to the fact that humans are free and that they should be free to act. Since it is in action that our purposes cross and conflict with one another, it is only post-action, not prior to it, that properly speaking, law becomes relevant. Given what I just said, it should be obvious that any law that is designed to preempt action will be an anomaly, a distortion within this legal system. There is no punishment for thought, nor should there be any. This is the creature whose dignity Awolowo charges us to defend with an all-consuming urge. I would like to suggest that our societies do not routinely evince this all-consuming urge to do so. We see it in our almost cavalier attitude to human life and to its degradation, beginning with there being no severe exercise on our imagination when it comes to our lived environment across the continent. Coming to terms with the existence of slums, gloating sometimes about the size of some of them, does not bespeak a concern to create a world without slums. When our intellectuals refuse to be exercised by the fate of the legal subject, the central focus of solicitude in the modern legal system, because most of us almost thoughtlessly repeat to the point of banality the refrain that we are a communal people. The stage is set for having a legal system that is only modern in name but cannot guarantee what Awolowo said should agitate us. Let us forget the reign of impunity in many of our jurisdictions. Let us forget the repeated claim to be operating under the rule of law. What is of moment is how well we are doing in infusing both operatives of our system and ordinary people, yes, ordinary people, in their relations with their system and with their fellow human beings with the appropriate temperament that makes following rules, ensuring that rules are followed, intervening to ensure that rules are followed in the ordinary course of our lives, a banal element of our ordinary lives. Because this is not what obtains the freedom of the individual to lead lives of their own authorship, the proverbial right to be let alone is always under threat from both the state and from our fellows. We see this when women are abused and violated on the street, because they are not conforming to someone else's idea of decent dressing. Remember, we have clear laws on indecent exposure on our books. We find it in play when individual lifestyles are criminalized because they do not conform to the specificity of, quote unquote, our culture. This is where Bobrisky, as an exemplar of the legal subject and its underlying principle of subjectivity, comes into clear relief. When the judge who presided over his case asked her if she was a man or a woman, he crossed a line, for that had no bearing on the case for which he was being prosecuted. Guess what? Soon after, a video circulated of police officers at a police station humiliating a suspect and stripping him naked to show that he's a man under his dressing. When the state, as embodied in a judge, and that judge, driven by his own prejudices, which is expected as a judge to strive mightily to distance himself from when enrolled in the temple of justice, proceeds to bring extraneous considerations to the discharge of his functions, the cause of the human subject and their entitlement to a life of dignity is not served, and it opens the door to others replicating that behavior. As everyone who is a student of liberalism knows, we do not protect people because we approve of their life choices. We do so because living their lives from the inside is precisely the sole requirement for living a life of dignity. And here I quote Kayode Esho, a retired justice and late justice of our Supreme Court. Quote, in the operation of the rule of law, the role of the judge cannot and must not be less. Judges must stand resolutely to prevent any attempted encroachment on the liberty of the subject by the executive. They must be alert, very alert to see that if ever there is a coercion by the executive, that action must be justified in law and not justified on the whims and caprices of man, end of quote. The freedom of ordinary Africans and their ability at the individual level to control their lives, lead lives marked by inviolate dignity of their persons, and concurrent limits on the reach of government and of their fellows in their daily lives must never, repeat, never be up for negotiation. Indeed, this ought to be the standard by which we judge the legitimacy and attractiveness of any government and the quality of any of our societies in the continent, as it increasingly is the case in other parts of the world that are also embracing and engaged in struggles like what I have here called our second struggle for freedom. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Malam. That was really, really interesting. Thank you for taking us on an intellectual tour. And I'm sure everybody, in the audience has, thinking of many of the issues you raised, and I'm sure they have questions. Maybe just to abuse my own privileges as one of the organizers, maybe I should start us off with, I'm not sure it's a question, but just a request for expatiation, if you will. So at the beginning of your keynote, you flagged this idea of Bobrisky. So in my preliminary remarks, I made mention of Bobrisky as individual and phenomenon. But I think you complicated that by the reference to the idea of Bobrisky as personnel. And then you basically suggesting that there is this interesting constellation of Idris Okuneye on the one hand and Bobrisky, on the other. I thought that was really fascinating. And I'm wondering if you could just unpack that a little bit for us. What do you mean by that? And how does that help us understand, what we're talking about here? And as you collect your thoughts, just a quick announcement to all the people in the audience. If you have any question, feel free to type into the chat so that we can take your questions one by one so that Malam can respond to them. Also, if you prefer to speak up, that's also okay. Professor Yuku is holding the digital key and it will let you in or out, let you speak, mute and unmute you. So I think somebody has already raised their hand. But so Malam, if you want to start with mine, and then we can take some other questions. Thank you again for honoring us with your intellect, with your with your questioning and with the amazing range that you've shown. It's a real pleasure to listen to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ebino. Very good question. And this is, again, where, as I read the presentations that are coming up, I'm very glad that, it covers some of the things that I have in mind. But this is the key. And I think in conversation with you, I told you that I'm struggling with how we actually wrap our head, around Bobrisky. And we need, again, to get outside of Nigeria because this is a human phenomenon. So think of RuPaul here, okay? That complexity is embodied, because nobody here, whether or not they love RuPaul, mistakes RuPaul for Charles something, which is his real name, and all that. But here, they have a name for what he does, okay? Especially when it becomes a performance. But it's also the life of many people, where they actually, that's what I mean by continuous self-presentation. Because many cross-dressers and transgender people and all that do present that way on a consistent basis, which then makes it into not a performance, but a mode of living. And that is the point where, for me, you have to respect the integrity of that mode of living. Meanwhile, that respect for the trueness of that person will not be necessary for somebody who actually does sex assignment surgery and then translates completely from being male to female or from being female to male, which is another level of complexity, that people do not pay attention to. And when that happens, people actually change their names, both legally and in every other way, and then insist that this is the only persona that they now have, and that then becomes one with their person. Okay? That has not happened with Bobrisky, as far as we know. Okay, so that means that there's nothing illegitimate about recognizing the trueness of his life as Mr. Idris Okuneye and Bobrisky. So that's why I do not use Bobrisky as an alias. And the reason why I call it a persona is precisely that he has chosen to assume that and consistently present himself as such. And that requires respect for the integrity, because that integrity is conjoined with the integrity of the person who adopts, and that's part of what I mean by being the author of his life script. Do I make some sense?
Absolutely.
So, and I want us to have all these complexities represented in our conversations and in our discussions. The good part of that, I'm sorry for the forest, is that it enables us to write more things than we otherwise would have if we had just limited ourselves to one conception, of this phenomenon. And I did not want, so when you were talking and you said phenomenon, I said, that's detracting from the integrity that I'm talking about. That's why I said I struggled with, I cannot call him an example because of what that might, and it cannot be a cipher because there's content, to that presentation. So I found the least problematic, of the ways. But then Bobrisky then becomes a legal subject. So when you then, as the judge, then say, are you a man or a woman? You have practically insulted that legal subject.
Thank you, Malam. Thank you. I'm sure people will have further thought about this. I can see that four of our colleagues have raised their hands, 4 participants. James, do you want to go to those people one after the other? Please, when you want to talk, please introduce yourself very quickly and then just go to the question for Malam. Thank you.
Professor Akin Adeshogo can speak now.
Okay, well, all right. Thank you, Madam, and thank you for the organizers of this event. My name is Akin Adeshokon. I teach comparative literature and cinema media studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. And sort of following up on Abino's question, which I think you answered very well, Madam, I just want you to explain the difference between the example and the exemplary, because that distinction wasn't clear to me. And I think that making that distinction clear will allow me to understand better how you understand or how you place Bobrisky or Idris Okuneye. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Adeshokan. James, can you take maybe two more so that Madam can answer? That was well put. That was very brief. So can we take maybe two more?
I think we could take it two in the chat.
Okay.
I don't know if Malam has access to the Q&A box.
Can you read them out, please?
So the first one is a challenge, the fact that Bobrisky has always identified as a cross-dresser and not as a transgender. I can read that again. Is a challenge, the fact that Bobrisky has always identified as a cross-dresser and not a transgender. And that's from Moji Sola Wilson. From the third one is from Amatala Salao. But would that even be possible in a country like Nigeria? What that refers to is not very clear, but I think it's from something Malam said. But would that even be possible in a country like Nigeria? The BBL can count as gender affirming center, and that's probably as far as Bobrisky can go, as far as sex, reassignment surgery. I don't know. Amatala, you may want to come on video to ask this yourself. The question is not very clear, but Malam asked two questions. We could start with those.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thanks, Professor Adeshokon. Here's the struggle. Example and exemplar in the dictionary do have meanings that make them synonyms. And that's where I struggle. But because you do not have what you have with example, that is, make an example, one of the meanings, of example, is what allowed me to say, I'm not going to use that. Exemplar does not come with that baggage. But you can substitute one for the other as long as you realize the possible negative meaning that people can read into saying that somebody is an example. So that's really all there is to that. And the exemplar, is not of cross-dressing or transgender or whatever. It is exemplar of legal subject. So whether it is cross-dressing, it's transgender, it's gayness, or it's heterosexual, or whatever it is, all those pale into insignificance, because what is important is that whoever is the embodiment of any one of those identities deserves certain forbearances in the modern state. So that's why I said Bobrisky, that we may want to say is a persona. So I'm actually making a radical claim. Okay? I am saying deserves integrity in that persona when it comes to the law. Okay? The critical difference, which I can exploit from our shared cultural inheritance, is, because Egungun is a performance and it's only temporary. Okay? When several years ago in Ibadan, an Egungun got killed in an auto accident, when he jumped onto the street and so, okay? Egungun is masquerade, the rest of us, okay? The person was charged, not with killing Egungun, but with killing the person who was under the mask. So that's the kind of thing that I'm saying, that,
Malam, can you kill somebody who's already dead?
No, but that's that's really what underscores the notion of the legal subject, you know, because if you were to just take the egungun as egungun and not continuous with the person under the mask, you could do anything to them. So if we use that to understand Bobrisky, then it means that Bobrisky is fair game in that persona. But we know that Bobrisky is a layer upon somebody, you know. The fact that his name is Idris Okuneye is totally irrelevant. His name could be anything. So that's what I mean by, so I'm not taking her as exemplar of the kind of life she has chosen. That would be a different discussion. But I'm taking her as somebody who deserves respect under the law in that presentation. In fact, here's the interesting part. The policeman who humiliated the individual that I'm talking about can say, we never really, you know, did anything to a person. We just did something to somebody who was pretending to be a person. I don't think that that's acceptable.
Thanks, Malam. I think I can see Dr. Ononuga's hand up.
Oh, no, just a minute. The point about cross-dresser and transgender. You see, that for me is, again, part of the complication that we have to take very seriously. A cross-dresser who is consistently so and who projects a personality that what he is under that dress is how he would like to be looked at, deserves to be taken seriously. And if that is the case, then there's even more case for transgendered people who are not assuming persona, but who are a certain way, but which we want to deny because we say that's anti-natural or that does not square with our culture. Which culture you're talking about, I don't know.
Thank you, Malam.
Prof. Leia Komolafe has a question. It's on video.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation and thank you for organizing this event. My question goes thus, you know, how do we address the problem with the Nigerian state concerning really keying into the idea of subjectivity? Because the Bobrisky's issue, I mean, when she was arrested and then still going on, still going through this prosecution and persecution by the Nigerian state. How do we address the question of how the populace decide to deputize the government? Because it's not just about the government, right? It's about the state, and by state I mean including its legal subjects. How do we ensure that this sort of deputization doesn't continue? Because the government saw that as, oh, good riddance to bad rubbish. So if anyone within the populace could do the job of the government without the government going an extra length, then it works. Because I'm sure this series of arrests that she has suffered in Nigeria couldn't have been possible without someone being tipped off. And this tipping off would come from individuals or collective groups who do not share this very important notion of subjectivity within the modern states. Without deputization, it will be impossible. So how do we address this? How do we ensure that an average Nigerian understands and keys into the concept of subjectivity and what it means for being a modern subject within democratic setting, which we are trying to make germinate and grow in Africa?
Thank you so much, Leia. Let's keep the questions very brief. We have about 30 more questions for Q&A, and we want as many people as possible to get their questions in. Okay, Chukwunwafo, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Taiwo. And I found your lecture very fascinating, especially the issue of freedom, fighting for the second freedom. But I mean, my question it somehow relates to the previous question, especially the idea of a nation, you know, because the point you raise is very complex, as we all believe. And I want you to, if it is possible, is it possible to think about Bobrisky as a problem that is fundamentally tied to the concept of Nigeria as a nation? And why I'm saying this is Nigeria actually prepared to exist as a nation in the first place? Because a nation has some fundamental principles upon which it is anchored, especially the rule of law. How do we see Bobrisky as an encapsulation of the failure of Nigeria as a nation, instead of separating Bobrisky from that failure of Nigeria as a nation? And secondly, maybe this is not what you're doing. I'm also thinking of what Roland Barthes describes as complex layers of gazes. So what I mean is, how do you see Bobrisky as a kind of a complex spectacle of gazes from multiple viewers? So these are just my thoughts, and I wonder if you have any answer to that. But thank you so much for your excellent presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Wanfor.
Yeah.
Prof, do you mind if I had one more from
Oh,
the
yeah,
Q&A
please go
box?
ahead. I'm taking notes.
So from the Q&A box, there are a lot of questions, Q&A people, so we'll just take them as we can. This is from an anonymous attendee. Professor Taiwo, you mentioned a component of the second struggle is a right to be let alone. Why this makes sense in the legal sense? A huge part of the conversation is culture. Speaking strictly of a collectivist culture where people generally don't believe in leaving others alone. As in, we exist not individually. Could it be that we have a legal system that does not align with the cultural philosophy of the people? And if so, how do we resolve this tension? Prof, you could take those three questions, and then we'll come back to the Q&A and let others want to come on video do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start with the last question. And it's actually connected to the previous two questions in this cycle of questions. You see, that precisely is the problem. Your assumption that we are a collective culture is problematic. We are not any more collective than other peoples in human history. And culture is always on the move. And in other parts of the world, including in Africa, yeah, people have struggled with and continue to struggle with how to bring the individual and the collective, back together, part of what Ebino said in his introductory comments. So my problem is that many African scholars want to turn collectivism into something that is etched into the DNA of Africans. I don't buy into that. So to Leia Komolafe's question, it is actually a failure of scholarship in Africa that those of us who have been sounding this alarm about the importance of the individual have no audience. And it's all the people running around about how Africans are collective, we are communal people and all that, all based on what I have called metaphysics of difference. They are the ones that all across the African continent, all the departments and all that in the universities. In fact, your philosophers always start out with, oh yeah, we're communal people. not because they have studied any people, including their own, but because they just assume, you know. And then, of course, they always put in the rider, oh, you know, we recognize individuality. But some of us have argued that recognizing individuality is not the same as taking the individual seriously. So my point is, for us to be able to stop this widespread deputization, we need, as scholars, to educate more critically, more differently, and allow debates within our scholarly places so that our younger people will realize that the human phenomenon is complex and that in our so-called collective cultures, there are notes there that recognize, you know, individualism and all that. All that is required is for us to actually nurture and build those notes so that people don't think that when they embrace individualism, they are being colonized or they are becoming westernized. And again, this will not be peculiar to Africa. It's a global thing. And that's the reason why, for me, not geographizing ideas, not attaching bylines to particular systems and all that is the best way to go. Bobrisky has a problem. No, Bobrisky is not a problem. It is people who think that Bobrisky should not be who are the problem. Because, as I think, you know, Ebino will put it, they are so much dominated by their own fears. Look, in this country where I live right now, every time somebody comes out to be excessively, you know, homophobic, especially from the right, we have found that more often than not, they have something that they're trying to get people to not see in themselves. Because usually they themselves are either gay or bisexual or vulnerable to being that way. The latest example is the guy running for governor of North Carolina. And we do have many examples of that. So the problem is not Bobrisky. If I go with Bobrisky and so on and so forth, I don't have any problem at all, you know, interacting with her and so on and so forth. But then if I feel that I might be sexually attracted to Bobrisky, and I say, oh, God forbid, you know, I got to go talk to my pastor, you know, and all that, then of course you come out just the way that in many Sharia courts in Nigeria and other places, the problem is always displaced onto women because they are the seducers, you know, the kinds of things that they wear, you know. So why not punish the guy who cannot control himself? And you then say that women should not show any part, you know, because somebody is vulnerable to, you know, what they see. No, Bobrisky is not the problem in any manner, shape, or form. And it does not matter, just as right-wing people here find out, we teach their children. They move to impossible places and the commute is so long because they want to get away from low lives like us. Then their students come to our schools and we teach them, and the students, their children never go back to them. That's the future of all those people who have those fears in Nigeria. Education for me is the key to all these three questions. And that's how we begin to change the orientation of even ordinary people to realizing that people should be allowed to live their lives. And this takes very serious education. This United States is still struggling with it. See the whole book burning, you know, business that is going on in this country. See all the attempts by various legislatures and so on and so forth to determine what should be taught in schools, you know. This is why this country remains the most backward among the so-called advanced countries when it comes to sex education for their infants, for their children. And with extremely dire consequences for the lives of young people here in terms of unwanted pregnancies and the problems that attach to them. In the Nordic countries where this is something that is right there from almost kindergarten, they don't have the same problem of unwanted pregnancies, you know, that they have here. We can learn some lessons from that.
Thank you, Prof. Ejiofor, do you want to come up? Ejiofor?
No, sorry, I mistakenly raised my hand. Sorry.
Okay,
Thank
that's
you.
okay. Yep. Noah Balogun.
Thank you very much, Professor Olufemi Taiwo. Thank you very much. I'm grateful for about your lecture. My question is straight. Because yesterday I was telling an audience that Bobrisky will have survived very well in the traditional African society because the people, had respect for individuals and tolerance and all of that. Would you think that Bobrisky will have survived in a traditional African society? Because I feel strongly that what we have currently is a baggage of Christianity and Islam. Because it is in Christianity that we have the original sin, whereby somebody who saw another person's nakedness, and the God killed a people because we're practicing homosexuality and all of that. I feel there is a baggage of all of that in what we have in contemporary Africa. How would you react to that, sir? Thank you.
Chukwuemeka, do you want to come up? Is Chukwuemeka there? Samuel.
Hello.
Yes, Samuel, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. and Professor Taiwo. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. So my question comes with a little bit of explanation. So there's a community in northern Nigeria called Yandaudu. Yandaudu has been in existence before, I guess, before the jihad of Usman Dan Fodio that kind of Islamized the whole of northern Nigeria. And this community still exists today, and there's a book about them. They are a queer community, actually, mostly men who play a feminine role in the society there, who are still protected. So Yandaudu community, in a way, is a cultural community of queer people. They are like, and we could call them in your framework, we say the Bobrisky community in that sense, right? But how does that mean, and what can my own question there, and based on that background, my question therefore is, protecting Bobrisky, in that case, does it also mean protecting cultural institutions that recognizes the other gender in a way? One, it's also, it's not limited to Yandaudu alone in the north. There are some cultural practices in northern Yoruba region, places like Ondo Ekiti, where a male person could embody the spirit of a female to become a priestess, and the person would have a feminine identity in terms of how they perform ritual, right? So, so that's my question. So protecting Bobrisky, does it also mean protecting cultural identity and protecting people like communities like Yandaudu, which I've mentioned earlier, and those ritualistic gender roles? And the final one is about binary way of thinking, where maybe the problem with the issue, could it be about binary way of thinking in our society where we assume that being a male is a single thing, but being a female is also a single thing, right? So those are my two questions. I don't know if the questions are clear, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akimbo.
Before you call the next person, let me just quickly note that the book the previous speaker was referring to is Allah Made Us. Yes. Islamic outlaws in sexual outlaws in an Islamic African city. And actually the author of the book, Professor Rudy Godio, is one of the speakers today, is one of the panelists. So, and I think I'm just pointing that out so that people will know that that's the title of the book and the author is here. And I'm sure he can speak about it later on.
Yeah, I didn't even notice. Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
Thank you, Prof. Just a thought question from the Q&A box. Anonymous attendee again. Professor Tai was an Africanist. I contend with the ethics of Africa's subjectification. at the level of the individual and the collective. I would like to know if Bobrisky is aware of this conference or has been engaged. Given that she is alive, I'm wondering if this is an opportunity to make space for the subaltern to speak. Professor Badari might also chime in, but
I can quickly respond to that. We made no attempt to reach out to Bobrisky. It will have been a nice idea to have Bobrisky in the audience, but I don't think Bobrisky's presence at this colloquium is pertinent to what you are trying to do. We are by no means objectifying Bobrisky. If anything, what we're doing is taking Bobrisky very, very seriously. So people are welcome to organize their own conferences and invite Bobrisky. In my own time, I'm going to try and reach out to Bobrisky. It would be nice to have Bobrisky. But right now, we did not make any attempt to reach out to Bobrisky. And I'm defending the principle that Bobrisky does not have to be in the audience in order for us to talk about and discuss Bobrisky. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Badari. In other words, this is not about disaffirming or affirming Bobrisky. This is just an intellectual exercise, which of course respects the lived experiences of folks like Bobrisky, but this is just for us knowledge generation. I'll therefore take a third question because you answered that, so Malam can have a set of 3 questions. And it's the last one from the Q&A box, I think, from Enoch Aboy. Can one individual assume 2 distinct subjectivities recognized by law? I thought an individual is a single legal subject. Would there be a difference between a transgender whose subjectivity is merged and a cross-gender with 2 subjectivities in the eyes of the law? I think this goes back to Malam's earlier distinctions at the beginning. Malam.
Let me start with that. No, there are not 2 subjectivities here. There's only one. And that subjectivity is embodied in the original person who is now assuming different presentations. So when I talk about the integrity, of that subjectivity, of that presentation, it is because that presentation is not anchored on emptiness. So that's why I said Bobrisky is not a cipher. 2, Bobrisky is not, quote unquote, a performer, as in, RuPaul's Drag Race. Okay? Bobrisky is a guy who dresses in a certain way and wants the world to interact with him in that presentation. So whatever was the beginning point of whatever it is, that presentation is part of that single subjectivity. We don't have 2 subjectivities. That's the first part. The second part is, yes, the second question. Yes, it is part of our duty as scholars critically to engage the world, especially the world around us and all that, and know exactly what is there, so that when we make our recommendations, we do so with an eye to where we are, what we are doing, especially in cases like this. Many of those who want to demonize Bobrisky or homosexuality or transgender and so on and so forth, they always start from this nonsensical position that these are foreign influences that are corrupting our societies. Which means if the person who asked the question about, protecting cultural institutions, if as scholars were better students of our own inheritances, they will not be too quick to start claiming. And I can tell you, all those who claim that stuff, for the most part, it's really about what they're going to eat. As I've said since my book came out, I go to all these places. Those people are not writing for Africa. They are writing for people here, for what they're going to get from the ACLS, other funding agencies and all that can be guilt-tripped, into funding their whatever it is. And that's why they are really very connected in the way that I am, and I'm making that claim to what is going on. All the scholars that I cited you now, I dare you to find any decolonizer who writes about Obafemi Awolowo's political philosophy. End of story. So I do have a right, to say that. And to that extent, yes, if those cultural institutions are there and people are now trying to use the instruments of the state or their own conscience preferences to delegitimize them, to make lives led in those communities, unbearable, yes, we should get on their cases and tell them to back off. And that would be the most consistent thing with the thesis that I'm pushing, that under the modern state, the life led from within, chosen by the individual, even as part of that community, as long as we know that they are not being coerced into being in that community, as long as the option is open to them, even if they are born into the community, for them to opt out when they come of age and decide to carve their own path through life, I don't have any problem with it. For Noah Balogun's question about traditional African society, that's a locution that I don't use. And it's not a question I can answer because I do not recognize anything called traditional African society. You can talk to me about, 17th century Oyo, or you can talk to me about, 19th century Oyo. And if anybody tells me that 19th century Oyo was the same Oyo that was there in the 15th century, I don't think that would be a scholarly exchange. I'll just tell them you're welcome. Have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prof. Is it okay to take a last set of questions? We have about
let's do that.
9 more minutes. Okay. So, Aston, do you want to go for it? Aston? Okay. Dr. Delacroix, I realize you had a question earlier. Do you still want to go for it?
Yes, I still want to go for it.
Okay.
Yeah. Good morning, Prof. And thank you very much.
Thank you
For your very, very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed listening to that. First, I want to bring something to your attention that I think in the case of Bobrisky, she has crossed from being a cross-dresser to actual trans woman. Because she said in an interview recently, right, I've been a woman long enough for you to think I am one, and there's no going back on this. So I think that in that sense, right, like the whole idea of saying I'm a cross-dresser was to evade the legal implications at the time that the state was bearing on them. And she was not the only person. There's also James Brown, who quickly said, I'm also a cross-dresser. This is just an act. And then trying to put that as a persona rather than, an identification. But I think that there is something this brings up is the idea that, or let me ask the question that way. To what extent do you think that the problem that we also deal with is also that we don't have language for some of these terms? We import them from society where they're already preloaded with politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about cross-dresser, transgender, we filter these ideas from the right-wing conservative evangelical politics of the United States that has its own history, has its own complication, has its own partisanship, right? And so by the time it comes to us, we are not dealing with individuals alone, but we're also dealing with a different kind of noise, some other cultural noise, and that is part of the problem. And how can our law system, our legal system, begin to address these issues, right? Without, to address the language problem, first of all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ononuga, you have a question? Paul.
Yeah, no, actually, it's I just realized now that I shared the link with a friend, and it's the friend who used the link that's appearing as Paul Ononuga II.
Okay, that's all right.
Yeah, so maybe you can go ahead
subjectivities.
to ask this question.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll read one from the Q&A box. Is it that we're afraid of who we truly are? Okay, no, this is not a question, sorry. Okay, I think those are all the questions from the Q&A.
Okay.
Does any of the panelists want to ask a question?
Yes.
Okay. We can take just two more. So yours and maybe one final one. Then we can close this particular session.
So mine is not a question. Oluwayinka Arawomo. Someone asked a question in the chat that is Bobrisky now officially she? So I just wanted to clarify. I was trying to answer your question. It gave me the version of live. I wanted to delete and type, so it deleted your question. So you don't feel like it's a cancel culture. Yeah, I'm so sorry. So I think my conversation will address that question. So I was trying to address your question, but I deleted it by mistake. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you, Dr. Arawamo. So if there isn't any other question, I think we can wrap up this particular session and thank Malap.
Let me say a word to Ojogba Adelakun,
Yep.
because I don't want her to withdraw my Ibadan citizenship. So you can never be too sure with this Miss Yoga people. But anyway, but on a serious note, you are right. And the reason why I wasn't sure that he's gone that far, in terms of, really changing. And I've read some of his reports, some of the reports, and all that. And again, it comes down to my insisting on the integrity of Bobrisky, and respecting, and if that move is completed, all the better, and it does not matter what anybody, thinks, given what I have shared. And you are right about language, but I don't want us to make too much of that. Okay. Taiwan was the first country in Asia to legalize gay marriages. Okay. South Korea, as we speak, is a majority Christian country. So some of these pressures that come to Africa that made people in Uganda want to kill people for being gays, they manifest in other parts of the world, that are outside whatever it is. The difference between them and us is that we like to play ostrich, and many of our people, especially the so-called leaders in the universities and so on and so forth, cannot separate what I call their conscience preference from their tasks as academics and scholars who should be open to all possibilities and argue with what they, disagree with. All they do is demonize it. They don't even read, about all this. So I think that, yes, if there's something that some other place named, pretty much in Russia, China, and all those places, close to 90% of the language of science in those cultures now are borrowings from, English, French, German. We should not have any difficulty doing that. It is just for our scholars to do the needful in terms of expanding the horizon of those to whom we deliver our tuition. I hope I make some sense. And to that extent, it is the collapse of the legal system that is worrisome now. Instead of our pushing back the boundaries, of excellence in our legal system, it has completely collapsed. You no longer have any judge in the likes of Kayode Esho or, Okuta Otutu. And these were all judges, because I know I've studied their writings and all that, who were absolutely invested in the question of the individual and the freedom that comes to it. We no longer have that. And that is something that is going to be haunting us for a long time to come in terms of how we rebuild our judiciary. So.
Thank you so very much, Professor Taiwo. I think at this point, we'll take a 5-minute break. Professor Badar, is that right? Then we'll come back for the first panel.
Actually, about 9 minutes. So we'll reconvene at 12:50, 9 minutes from now, for the first panel. Let me just quickly.
And I want to thank all of you for your generosity, not just in your patience, but also in all the great questions that you asked me. I really,
we should be the ones thanking
them.
you. Thank you so much, Falan, for honoring us with your reflections and your thoughts. We really, really appreciate it. So we'll be back in 9 minutes at 12:50 on the dot. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
11:50, sorry.
Oh,
it's 11:50.
No. I'm on the.
I know you're in Eastern time.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
11:50. Okay.
Yes, sorry. Because that's the time we are on. It's 11:50. I'm with you.
Well, we in DC are usually ahead of everybody. So
that's the reason why they're always talking about the elite. So.
Okay, we'll be back at 11:50.
Hey, thank you. Now you are talking. Hello.
I was going to say it's 12:50, but I'm going to say it's 11:50. Can we start the first panel? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Are we good? Professor Adubi, are you good to go?
Yes, I am, if everyone is ready. Okay, once again, thank you everyone for joining us this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Omolade Adumbi, and I have the task of moderating the first panel. Thanks to the organizers for bringing up this one-day symposium together. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce the speakers, and the speakers will be asked to speak in the order in which they are introduced. And at the end of their presentations, we'll have a Q&A session, and I'll encourage all of our participants to please post their questions to the Q&A section of Zoom, and we'll try as much as possible to answer all of your questions at the end of the presentations. So first to present will be Dr. Rudolph Gaudio. Dr. Gaudio teaches anthropology, linguistics, and media studies at Purchase College, State University of New York, and has had teaching and research affiliations with Bayero University, Kano, and the Federal College of Education Technical, Zuba. His book, Allah Made Us, Sexual Outlaws in an Islamic African City, is an ethnographic account of Yandaudu, Hausa-speaking men who are said to talk and act like women. I think one of the participants already mentioned the importance of this book to what we are discussing today. So he has also written on the use of Nigerian pidgin, that is Niger pidgin, in popular music and stand-up comedy. And his current project investigates urbanism, nationhood, language, and race in Nigeria's planned capital city, Abuja. So Dr. Gaudio's presentation will be followed by that of Dr. Bukola Ochei. Dr. Ochei is a lecturer in the Department of Public Law at the University of Ibadan, and currently, or at least beginning from January, she will be a fellow at the University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor. Our research interests are criminal justice, gender and the law, sports law, and emerging technologies and the law in Nigeria. And our current research focuses on what she calls the religious, cultural, social, criminal, and human rights dimensions of cross-dressing in Nigeria. Dr. Ochei is a member of several professional bodies, including the Nigerian Bar Association, and she's also the recipient of many awards locally and internationally. And as I said earlier on, she's going to be a University of Michigan African Presidential Scholars Fellow beginning in January at the University of Michigan. Next is Dr. Matthias Krings. Dr. Krings is a professor of cultural anthropology at Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany. And he has specialized in the study of African popular culture, media, and visual anthropology, the anthropology of the body and religion. His current research focuses on skin color-based categorization practices beyond racialization and on the global mainstreaming of African popular music, recently labeled Afrobeats. Among his publications are edited volumes about global Nollywood, Tanzanian Bongo Media Awards, and distributed productivities. His most recent book, African Appropriations, Cultural Difference, Mimesis, and Media, was published by Indiana University Press, and he has done extensive field work in both Nigeria and Tanzania. Last but not the least is Ololade Faniyi. Ololade is an African feminist activist scholar and PhD student in women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Emory University. Our graduate research reimagines the relationship between technology and African feminist thought at the intersections of surveillance regimes, platform governance, and digital colonialism. She's a sub-editor on gender and feminism at The Republic and African Regional Advisor for FRIDA, that is the Young Feminist Fund, and a graduate researcher for the Atlanta Interdisciplinary Artificial Intelligence Network. Faneyi's work explores Bobrisky as a messy signifier for Nigeria's gender trouble, highlighting the fractured intimacies Bob's controversies trigger within Nigerian feminist queer digital publics. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists. And so Rudolph, you go first.
Thank you, Dr. Adumbi. And I would like to start by thanking our organizers, Dr. Yeku, Dr. Obadare, James and Ebenezer. Thank you so much for all the work you've put into organizing us. It's a very exciting opportunity. Thank you, Professor Taiwo, for your very stimulating keynote address. And I'm kind of honored and embarrassed to be going first. So by way of kind of reintroduction, I did write the book, Alamedas, about Ndaudu. My talk today is not really focusing on that. There's only a few tie-ins that you'll hear. I will say up front that Ndaudu, there are some similarities, just to get it out of the way. Ndaudu basically lead a continuous life of moving back and forth between male and female roles. They're not transgender in the sense that Bobrisky can be considered transgender. No surgical manipulation of the body, only cosmetic and only temporary. So there will be more to say about that. I will also say that I refer to Bobrisky as she. I don't think she is particularly obsessed with policing our pronominal use or the name use, but since she presents as she, that's how I'll be referring to her. Although other people in the clips I'll be showing refer to her and to him. But again, I haven't heard her police anybody about these things. So I originally, when I was invited to make this talk, I wasn't that much, I'm not an expert on Bobrisky. I wasn't even that much aware of Bobrisky until maybe a couple years ago, when some friends of mine in Nigeria alerted me to her. I don't follow social media, or I certainly wasn't following social media very much. So when I was invited to participate in this panel, I was a little bit like, why me? I don't really follow Bobrisky. I mean, I realized that my research overlaps topically. So I welcome the opportunity. When I put together the abstract that was circulated, I was focused a lot on what I knew about Bobrisky from the media, her own presentation, the way people talked about her in English from Nigeria, much of which is focused on Lagos, which is where she is most of the time. But I'm not an expert on Lagos. It's not a city I've spent a whole lot of time in. I'm much more focused in my research in Kano and Abuja, more the middle and north of the country. So as I was kind of diving into the social media sphere, I realized, like, what's going on up north? Because I have an interest in the way in which Hausa-speaking Northern Nigerians do or do not engage with the wider Nigerian Naija public that is largely communicating in English and or Naija Pidgin. And there's often a kind of disconnect, but it's not a total disconnect. So I kind of, based on that frame, went into looking at social media representations and recontextualizations of Bobrisky in Hausa language social media. So that's what the clips I'm going to be sharing with you today. And I have a number of them, so I need to go very quickly. I won't be able to play more than a few choice clips. I also wanted to just give shout outs to people who've done the thing that I thought I was going to do, which is like point out the contradictions. Unoma Azua 3 years ago wrote Bobrisky, A Mirror for Nigeria, where she basically kind of already had done it. I didn't know about this until recently. And then most recently, Professor Christopher Agbedo wrote Bobrisky Saga, A Symbol of Naija's Endless Cruise. This is like last week in the Vanguard, a really biting editorial that basically calls out Nigerian lawmakers for getting obsessed with this one transgender social media person instead of focusing on problems like electricity, poverty, health, floods, etc. And in a way, one might also wonder about our own obsession with Bobrisky. I really doubt a panel on electricity in Nigeria would yield the urgency. And it's urgent, but I don't know that we'd organize a panel so quickly about it because it's so taken for granted. Bobrisky's new and shiny, and we're all looking at her, and I'm one of them. I'm just calling out our own practice in a way that Professor Agbedo challenged the lawmakers. So my talk now might more properly be called Fear, Loathing, and Love from Lagos to Kano, Bobrisky Goes North. I'm going to be showing you a few clips from social media, YouTube and TikTok. And they're in Hausa, but sometimes moving into between Hausa and English, and in one case, Yoruba. And what I'm interested in these clips is how the seeming contradictions in Bobrisky's persona become an object of both fascination and critique. I mean, this is general about Bobrisky, no matter what language you're looking in. So my own is in looking at like the contradictions revealed in the treatment of Bobrisky, not just her contradictions, but the contradictions in people's responses to her. And given the focus on Hausa language media, I'm interested in how what that tells us about the relationship of the Hausa language public to the Naija public at large, especially one in which, for some Northern Muslim ideologues, gender and sexuality can be useful as a way to distinguish a Northern Muslim public sphere from a more decadent Naija, Southern-based, English and Naija pidgin-based public sphere. So I'll be kind of giving some examples of that. All right, now I'm going to share my screen. And go to my talk. Okay. Are y'all seeing talk? It's loading. Okay. So I have 4 clips. I won't show you all of them, but I'll refer to all of them. One is by Abis. He goes by Abis Fulani. I don't know exactly where he's based. It seems as if he might be in Germany a lot of the time. And he basically is like a translator of popular media from the English language media sphere in Nigeria into Hausa. So this one is from a few months ago before she was arrested, when Bobrisky had won a prize for Best Dressed Nigerian Woman. And he's basically saying Bobrisky has annoyed Nigerian women by winning a prize to be Best Dressed Nigerian Woman. Is he? Okay, I'll show you, I'll play a few seconds.
To a halin yanzu Bobrisky ya ɓata wa matan Najeriya rai, kuma halin yanzu kaf Najeriya na ɗaya daga cikin abin da ake tattaunawa akai a halin yanzu. Wannan ya biyo bayan lashe gasar macen da ta fi kowace mace iya dressing a Najeriya da Bobrisky ya yi. A maimakon Bobrisky ya fito ya ba wa mata hakuri ko ya tausasa su ganin ya cinye musu gasa, sai cewa yanzu babu yadda za ku da ni ma na shigo cikin sisterhood din, bara ku ji da kunnen ku. See, you guys said you have no choice. You have to accept him part of the sisterhood. You guys have no choice. But the part of the sisterhood already, so deal with it. Deal with it. Wanda ba sani ba, asali Bobrisky a namiji aka haife shi. To fa a halin yanzu Bobrisky ya ɓata wa matan Najeriya rai.
So the interesting thing about this is that he does this moment of the reveal. If you didn't know anything about Bobrisky, is only at the moment I ended the clip that he says, by the way, if you didn't all know, Bobrisky is really a man, but originally a man. So he does that thing. Other than that reveal, this is pretty much a straightforward like translation of English language, and he actually does a live translation of Bobrisky's own speech. And otherwise, he's translating from newspaper articles that he actually cites, as you can see in the clip there. So what's, come on, move on. What's interesting in this and in many of the other clips that I have is if you look at the replies, the comment section, you'll see both the kind of judgmental, sad faces, or this makes me puke, or like, may God help us, with laughter. And often like just humor, like this is hilarious. So there's both, right? A humor and a kind of disgust factor. Moving on, Tuskar Al-Umma is a very low budget outfit that is trying to kind of inculcate Islamic morality into a Hausa language public by looking at by calling out un-Islamic behavior in the public sphere. So they do this in a variety of ways. They mostly don't talk about Bobrisky, but they did a few videos about Bobrisky. This one is called "One Has Successfully Transplanted the Womb of the famous Dundaudu Bobrisky in England," that allegedly claims that Bobrisky went to England to get a uterus. This has never been confirmed. Bobrisky has never said something so explicit. She's talked about going abroad for gender confirmation surgery, but she never talked about getting a womb. Taskar al-Ummah tends to try to render Bobrisky in a way that's very explicitly transgender, but in a way that she herself doesn't do. It's almost like they're taking a page out of what Western transgender practices are and then mapping them onto Bobrisky in a way that there's really no evidence for. So for example, and they also do that, they also render her as a Dundaudu, or at least they say in some videos that she started out by being a Dundaudu, by which I think they mean she started out by cross-dressing and then went full on to become trans. And my other screen is just blank, so I just have to go from memory about some clips that I want to show, but I can't do it in the interest of time, where they say that they emphasize her otherness, not just in terms of her gender and her embodied gender, but also in terms of religion and ethnicity. So they'll refer to her as Idris Bobrisky very commonly. She is Bobrisky. They refer to her as he most of the time, Idris Bobrisky. They will introduce her and say she's from Lagos, she's a Yoruba, and she claims to be a Muslim. They always hedged her Muslimness with she claims to be, or she answers to the name of Muslim, but then they are obviously offended by her claims to Islamicness. They call her a Dundaudu who became more fully a woman. They claim that she's had everything replaced, like up to a uterus, even while they continue to call her he, occasionally moving into she, but mostly staying with he. And at one point in the video that I have here, which is titled, "My main goal now is marriage." Bobrisky, the famous homosexual who changed her being into a woman. That's what the title is there on YouTube. In this video, they call out her for having bought a big house. They say she's really connected with the big homos and lesbians. They can't decide what to call her, homo or like danluati, which is like sodomite, or ermatigo, which is lesbian. And they call her out for her big connections around the world and around Nigeria. They say she bought a multi-million-dollar house in Lagos where she invited imams. And in this video, they say that she called the imams Nasu Yorubawa, their kind, Yoruba Malams, which is a way that kind of invokes some Hausa Muslim ideas that Yoruba Muslims are less kind of strict, less on point than they Hausa Muslims are. So that's invoked in this video. So in any event, this kind of thing is trying to really other Bobrisky, to make her into a Southern Muslim other that is kind of horrifying. But then the last clips I'll share with you are some young people on TikTok who are uptaking Bobrisky in ways that are not so judgmental like the first two videos that I'm sharing with you here. One is somebody who goes by Prime Vincent. He's based in Jos. My guess from his name is that he's a Christian from the Middle Belt. That's my assumption. And here he's had a few videos where he basically takes Bobrisky's cadence, but supposedly renders it into Hausa.
Sai sun kwashe Instagram skits makers masu wasan bakuwanci. Allah sauke, God forbid, Olumaje. Bolas!
So basically, he's doing this kind of playing up a Bobrisky thing, like, I'm gonna have a party, I'm gonna show you all, I'm gonna take everybody out, and I'm gonna have senators and ball players and rich people in Lagos, like pulling out the kind of class aspirational boasting, blingy life that Bobrisky leads, and the kind of attitude that she projects in her speech. Clearly, this is like an appreciation, mimically as flattery, of Bobrisky. And then the final one is this Ishat Aliyu, who I believe is in Bauchi, although I've also seen videos from Canada from her. And she's responding to people who apparently in her comments and other videos had said she was like the Hausa version of Bobrisky, that she looked like Bobrisky. She starts in Hausa, but she ends in English.
Na ga comment nan ya kai guda kusan 10. Dan na sa guguru kawai a kaina shine nayi kama da Bobrisky. Yeah, come on guys. I'm a lady. I'm a girl. I'm a woman. I'm not a man, so stop saying that we resemble. A lot of you are saying I resemble Bobrisky when I do my hair and then my makeup, my dress. No, we are not resemble, okay? But I like the way I like the way he dressed and the way his acting is given, but we are not resemble. I'm fat, he's slim, he's white, I'm chocolate. So I'm not Bobrisky House of Basher. Please.
So I can stop sharing. So what I find really interesting, and especially in these final videos, is the extent to which, despite the efforts of this kind of Taskar al-Ummah, like these Northern Muslim ideologues, to kind of distinguish their public from this broader Naija public, or even the efforts of like kind of the Abis Fulani, just to translate with a negative valence what Bobrisky is doing. You have these younger folks on TikTok who are just sort of engaging Bobrisky as a popular performer and finding her impressive. In the interest of time, I cut off that last young lady. She did say, like, you know, Bobrisky, I'm not her, but I like her. I like the way she dresses, but don't call me her. So there's a kind of appreciation of Bobrisky that is kind of escaping the bounds of these moral lessons. And that to me is a constant tension that I see in kind of Northern Nigerian popular culture of engaging the broader Naija sphere, but always with this kind of like, don't get too close to that Naija thing. It's kind of immoral and dangerous, but there's a lot of, increasingly, especially with social media, you see a lot of young people engaging with it. So that's a contradiction that I just want to throw out there. And my time is up, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panelists. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Rudolph. Next is Bukola Uche, 15 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Adumbi. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. I would like to talk about, I'm not focusing on Bobrisky, if you pardon me. I'm going to be talking about cross-dressing, but I think it fits into our discussion. I'm looking at, sorry, pardon me, I'm trying to share my screen, and then I will start. Okay. I followed and enjoyed Professor Taiwo's presentation, and I found it very interesting because I'm taking in a bit of what he said. I'm looking at subjectivity, but I'm looking at it within the context of the right to self-expression. And my topic is that I may dress as I please, as in the right to of an individual to self-expression in a collective Nigerian society. In this context, I'm looking at the right to self-expression that is cross-dressing as a right to self-expression, and the tension that has arisen as a result of cross-dressing because of the collectivist ideologies that Nigeria evinces, as opposed to the individualist expressions that we see in cross-dressing, and looking at how we can navigate, because it's here to stay. Self-expression is here to stay in any form, and we must chart a way forward. So I think I just summarized everything I want to say, but I'll start back from the beginning and talk about the right to self-expression, which is protected in the Nigerian Constitution in Section 39. And it says that every person shall be entitled to freedom of expression, including freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart ideas and information without interference. And I'm looking at cross-dressing within that context. And self-expression is the right to present yourself. It comes about in different ways. You express yourself by your facial expressions, by the tone of your voice. You can express anger, you can express sadness. In art, in music, and in dressing, we express our opinions, our points of views, our beliefs, our emotions, and our expressions. All these can be situated within the concept of self-expression. And why is self-expression important? Self-expression is important because it tells us about our interests, our characteristics, it presents our character in a way that reflects others. And when you look at self-expression, you realize that we are programmed from birth to express ourselves, and that expression is important to meet our survival and social needs. And self-expression offers a way of deciding who we are, and how we connect, who we connect to, how we connect, and who we belong to and who we belong with. So self-expression is actually important to our well-being. Proper self-expression projects confidence and leads to healthy connections and leads to self-respect. So looking at looking at self-expression within the context of culture, we know that culture is a set of rules and values and beliefs that are shared by a group of people, and it could be tribal, it could be ethnic, it could be within a religious group. And interpersonal relationships all come within the context of culture. And culture includes norms, practices, symbols, language, dress, myths, ideologies, rituals, and ceremony. Everything comes within the context of of culture. And culture is important to Nigerians. Everything we do, everything we are, because culture shapes how we think, how we behave, how we interact, and develop cultural intelligence in relation to others. Culture is important to us because it provides a sense of belonging and ideology. It influences views, values, and aspirations. It brings about loyalty. It influences our humor. It influences our dressing. Culture teaches us what we should value. Things like hard work, dedication, honesty, respect, and care for elders, and what it means to live a good life. Culture is also a means of transmitting our core values from one generation to the other, and gives meaning to life across a range of human activities, including social, education, religious, and social. And now, in the context of cross-dressing, we must recognize that cultural norms and values have shaped perceptions of gender expression. When we look at culture and expression within the context of collectivism and individualism, we'll realize that these affect considerations of cross-dressing, particularly in Nigeria, where we have traditional gender roles that are deeply entrenched. And there are broad examples of Nigerian culture, like in the Yoruba group tribe, where when you want to express yourself, when you want to greet, the males prostrate, the females kneel down to, their gendered roles. Even in greeting, you would not see a young man kneeling down to greet. You would stop him and say, no, you prostrate. And a girl cannot prostrate, she kneels to greet. So we see our cultural expressions in everything we do in Nigeria. And culture now has extended to gender presentations and expressions. So there's an influence of ethnic, familial ties that have shaped perceptions of acceptable behavior. Sorry, I was moving faster than my slides, that have shaped acceptable behavior, and we can see a tension between personal desire and cultural obligations. And cross-dressing underscores a conflict between traditional values and modern norms, even though we can argue that cross-dressing is not necessarily a new thing. If we look at my previous presenters talk about his book on Yandaudo, you see that we've had cross-dressing in Nigeria. We can relate to cross-dressing from time to the present, but within the context of cross-dressing now in Nigeria, there is a tension. And this has led to questions about the acceptance of cross-dressing. And now, the right to expression allows elements of who we are, our identities, religious beliefs. Cross-dressing allows, or the right to expression, the right to dress, allows us to present ourselves in ways that are acceptable. So the beauty of Nigeria right now is that we have male cross-dressers, we have female cross-dressers, we have cross-dressers who do it purely for entertainment purposes. We have people like Miriam Akpao-Kagi, also known as Tauma. We have Chooks. I think you can see the pictures. Can you see my pictures? You can see we have an entertainer called Steve Chooks, also known as Madame Teresa. We have Madame Gold. These are all entertainers who dress as either male or female to express, to entertain. So we have, but we also have cross-dressers who are not, who come out to say, we are cross-dressers, we dress for ourselves. We have a few that there has been contentions if they are cross-dressers or if they are transgender. We have some cross-dressers who have come out to say, no, I'm not transgender, I am purely a cross-dresser. We have, I think we have John Tel Peters, that's JP Blush. We have Toby the Creator, that's Ogbolu Ifeanyi, who says he's purely a cross-dresser. We have, but whether in the context of transgender or whether in the context of just purely cross-dressing, we see that they are expressing themselves, and that our laws actually respect the right to self-expression. Now, in terms of collectivism and individualism, I'm drawing a distinction between collectivism and individualism within our cultural context. And we see collectivism in our cultural context as interdependence, in the sense that we are all dependent on each other. We work together. We are not looking at the individual, we are looking at the collective. Everything you do is for the collective goal. Whereas individualism looks at self-independence. In terms of collectivism, you look at group success. In terms of individualism, we are talking about individual success. In collectivism, we're talking about care for each other as opposed to self-care. I take care of myself. We look at under collectivism, self-restraint, and then as opposed to individual expression. And then we talk about family and society comes first. So we talk about not so much privacy as we talk about, your family has the right to be in your business. Whereas individualism looks at the person, my right to privacy, even from my family. I want to be by myself. I want to do things on my own. So now we have a tension between collectivism and individualism. Within the context of collectivism and individualism, I did a lot of work with, I did a lot of research on Nietzsche and Mises and their work on individualism and collectivism. And I found it very interesting that Nietzsche talks about collectivism and individualism by telling us that individualism is not against collectivism, but in order to understand and appreciate collectivism, you must understand that it comes from several individualists coming together to form a collective. We cannot have universal collectivism. We have it only as groups, whether as ethnic groups, whether as a country, whether as religious groups. We have individualism and we have collectivism not as a unified ideology, but doctrines that are separate. And all this together, when you bring them into the context of self-expression, highlights a tension between the right to dress as you please, self-expression, and cultural norms and values on cross-dressing. And in Nigeria, the tension with relation to cross-dressing can be seen in a lot of perception of cross-dressing as a negation of the established gender division. There has been attempts to ban cross-dressing. In 2022. There was a same-sex Marriage Prohibition Act bill that attempted to ban cross-dressing and impose a stiff penalty of imprisonment for 6 months for cross-dressing. But even within the context of that bill, you would still see a tacit acceptance of cross-dressing for entertainment purposes. So I think within that context, we can see that there was a bit of hypocrisy in our perception of cross-dressing. And within the context of our cultural perception of cross-dressing, it has led to harassment of cross-dressing. Personalities like Bobrisky and J. Boogie, amongst a host of other personalities, have recorded incidents of harassment, people shaming them, humiliation, ridicule, and beatings, and in certain instances, even death. There have been 2 recorded instances of recent of the death of one cross-dresser, that's Area Mama in Abuja 2 months ago. And then we have one in Lagos that happened, I think, last month, to show you that we are talking about the invasion, the disregard for the right to self-expression, and it had the negative implications of that on cross-dressers in Nigeria. And all this show that there is an expression of opprobrium for cross-dressing and even androgynous dressing, and to even the extent of women who wear trousers. We see people condemning them, even in personal groups and in homes. We still have, so we have a long way to go in Nigeria in order to balance the right to self-expression. Now, we know that self-expression is protected in Nigerian law in Section 39 of the Constitution, and we must deal with the reality that cultural norms have the power to dictate acceptable behavior and of individuals within the context of specific practice of cross-dressing, and that there's a contrast between collectivist and individualist ideologies, which reinforce the complex nature of cultural identity. And this reveals, well, we say strong communal values. However, we cannot deny that there is a gradual assertion of individualistic aspirations in our citizens in Nigeria. And what this tells me is that there is a need for a nuanced understanding of how cultural and collectivist dimensions interact with individualist expressions on the right to self-expression in Nigeria. And for me, I see a future where the interplay between the individual and collectivist factors will continue to influence the future of self-expression and acceptance in Nigeria. So I feel that there needs to be more research and engagement on the right to self-expression, identity within the Nigerian space, and that we should have more symposiums like this to encourage cross-fertilization of ideas with regard to the right to self-expression, gender identity, and all that within the Nigerian space, and then not just within the Nigerian space, but that looking at it as trans-border, because we're talking about fundamental human rights, protecting rights of the individual, which I feel is actually very important for us. So for me, I haven't ended. I'm about to end, sorry. We can see that collectivist cultural ideologies can be restrictive, and they restrict the gender roles and then expressions, but there needs to be coexistence with individualistic desires for authenticity and self-expression. And for me, the tension between collectivist and individualist ideologies must be interrogated, because we want to promote the individual's right to self-expression within our collectivist cultural ideas. Now, the truth is that cross-dressing in Nigeria challenges traditional gender roles and invites broader discussions about gender fluidity and social acceptance in Nigeria. And for me, I think we need a more nuanced understanding of how individual agency operates within a communal framework. So to me, cross-dressing extends beyond personal identity and calls for an evaluation of cultural narratives that surround gender in Nigeria and the right to expression in Nigeria.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Matthias. Kambukola, can you please?
Yes, I'll stop sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, let me try and share my screen here. Okay, so Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really appreciated that I've been invited to be part of this symposium. Please bear with me that I have to read because otherwise I won't be able to keep time. So looking at Bobrisky's career as a Nigerian social media personality from 2016 to the present, one will notice not only a transition from male to female, but also from a poor, slim, and dark-skinned no-name to a wealthy, voluptuous, and light-skinned celebrity. I'm particularly interested in these other transitions, which have received less attention in the public debate about Bobrisky. I suggest that they are interesting to note because they relate to dimensions of human differentiation other than gender, namely class, beauty, race, and celebrity. The question then is how and why do they intersect with Bobrisky's being a woman? Let me position myself as an outsider in more ways than just one. As a German white and straight cis male, I'm trying to make sense of Bobrisky's gender performances from a vantage point that is rather remote from the social and cultural context in which her performances are embedded. So as you will note, I'm really speaking from afar, from a distance. As an anthropologist, however, I hope that my outsider position can help us notice some things that others may not notice because they simply take them for granted. This means that in what follows, I may touch on issues that are considered sensitive from a transgender political perspective. Rest assured, though, that I will try to avoid hurting anyone's feelings as much as possible. My talk is based on a skepticism of ontological formulations such as being X, Y, or Z. Instead, I opt for a practice theoretical perspective and refer to Bobrisky's gender performances as being a woman. Since we're talking across disciplines, let me briefly explain what I mean by this. According to sociologist Harold Garfinkel, social reality is a practical and ongoing accomplishment. This means that we don't just enter social interactions as teacher or student, as husband or wife, or in any other given social role, but that we have to practically inhabit and perform these roles in order to make sure that our interaction partners understand in which of our many social roles we are facing them. In their seminal article, and I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but still, in their article, Doing Gender, going back to 1987 already, Candace West and Don Zimmerman built on this idea and applied it to gender. Since then, gender has been seen as something that is not just there, not something that only that one simply has, qua reference to one's sex as a natural category or a category believed to be natural, but as something that one must perform in social interactions on a daily basis. This involves several registers, including language, the body, clothing, objects, and many more. To be clear, all of us are engaged in doing gender every day, sometimes consciously, more often habitually. So when I talk about Bobrisky being a woman, I do not mean to imply that she's merely performing in the colloquial sense. However, because their identity depends on passing, transgender people tend to be more self-reflexive about their gender performances than those who are gender normative, or at least a certain type of transgender people, let me put it this way. So here's the argument. Bobrisky's being a woman is so perfect that resemblance or similarity turns into sameness. it is the very boldness and perfection of her female gender performance, aided by medication and surgery, that threatens to destabilize conventional notions of the congruence of sex and gender, that is, gender determined by sex. Some see this as a provocation, a national disgrace, as one politician put it, and her recent persecution seems to be based on a moral panic. At the same time, however, her notoriety, and based on that also her income, depend on her being at the center of heated controversy and adversarial talk. In the eyes of many Nigerian commenters, Bobrisky's womanness is something that only happens on the screen surface, aided by digital tools. And I quote somebody here, anytime they ban Snapchat, wallahi, this guy go really suffer for social media because no filter go day for him to use again. End of quote. For commenters like this, biological difference lurks beneath the surface of Bobrisky's female gender performance. Note the similarity to Nigerian ideas about occult economies. Outside and inside can be different. Something that looks holy on the outside, on the surface, can turn out to be evil on the inside. Popular stories of rich people whose wealth is ill-gotten through blood money rituals, of Christian pastors who are Satanists in disguise, of beautiful women who turn out to be sent by the devil. A biological man doing being a woman ties into this notion particularly well. Interestingly, transgender activists would also argue with an inside-outside discrepancy, albeit adding a third layer. According to the common transgender narrative, transgender people are born with an inner gendered self that is different from their material body, which determines how society treats them, and which in turn is seen as a problem that needs to be solved. One way to solve this is to realign gender and sex by altering the materiality of the body through medication and surgery, with the goal of achieving congruence between the inner self and the outer form. Bobrisky seems to advocate this. According to one media source, she has advised upcoming transgender individuals to go for proper surgical enhancement procedures so they can be who they truly want to be. End of quote. A transgender reading of Bobrisky's presentation of self on social media would argue that social media allows her to be who she truly is, a woman. At first glance, Bobrisky's career appears to be an unidirectional trajectory, a transition from male to female, and as such would be a case of the trance of migration, to use one of the concepts coined by Rogers Brubaker. Dissimulation from the former male body and male gender performance is constituted for this kind of transition. From a transgender perspective, achieving similarity to female sex and gender is only one step on a trans woman's trajectory, since the ultimate goal is sameness, that is, becoming identical to a woman. Becoming a woman. However, things are not so clear-cut with Bobrisky, and we have already been talking about them. One major difference from transgender practices in the global north is that Bobrisky has retained her Yoruba male birth name, which is also part of her social media profiles. This is rather unusual in European transgender practices, and I guess also in US American. Changing one's name is considered a very important part of transitioning. Similarly, the social media handle Bobrisky, at least to what I kind of found out from the web, is a combination of the male nickname Bobo she was given as a child and her self-described daring, risky attitude to life. She's also quoted as wanting, quote, people to keep guessing about her gender because that's what keeps her in the news, end of quote. This raises the question of how well the framework of European or US transgender discourse, the whole concept, fits Bobrisky's case. Obviously, she adapts this traveling model for her own purposes. On a side note, Nigeria also has cases of Brubaker's other two concepts of thinking with trans. And this has been mentioned before also. The trans of between and the trans of beyond. The social media personality James Brown, for example, who consciously moves back and forth between male and female gender performances and deliberately plays with them, is a case of the trans of between. The Yandaudu of the Muslim North, who are considered men who talk like women, to quote Rudy, and who use female clothing, names, and pronouns in their gatherings, would be another case. In such cases, a situational, playful leaning into the gender performances of the opposite sex is constitutive. Beyond the meaningful attribution of similarity to gender performances of any kind are cases of the trans of beyond, as they operate outside the binary gender logic. In Nigeria, media celebrity Derele Edun comes closest to this category. Sometimes labeled as cross-dresser, his performances, clothes, hairstyles, and makeup go beyond binary gender attributions. I quote him, "I just express myself, my individuality. I just want to be me." So how to make sense of the other transitions mentioned at the beginning, which in Bobrisky's case seem to have gone hand in hand with gender transition? Slim to voluptuous, dark skin to light skin, poor to rich, no name to celebrity. The mise en scène of each is carefully curated in social media postings, such as in still images or video clips that emphasize the chubbiness of thighs and buttocks, shaking them in the viewer's face, demonstrate the effects of skin lightening products, using before and after images, flaunt luxury cars and bags full of money. These are symbolic markers of categorical belonging that are to some extent translatable into each other. Taken together, Bobrisky's doing being a woman becomes visible as one that is modeled not just on any kind of woman, but on the Nigerian social type of the rich auntie or independent businesswoman, who in the past would have been called Mama Benz. Light skin, voluptuousness, the display of wealth through expensive clothes, jewelry, wigs, and the conspicuous spraying of Naira notes are part and parcel of the public appearances of this category of women at social events in Lagos. At the same time, these parallel transitions expand Bobrisky's entrepreneurial opportunities to become brand ambassador for a wide range of consumer products. In addition to celebrity, similarity seems to be at work here as well, in the sense that companies selling skin whitening products, for example, seek to associate their products with someone who has a history of using such products and who thus shows. Recently, Bobrisky became the brand ambassador for a hair product by US model Black China, who is known for a transgressive play with racial boundaries, not unlike Bobrisky's transgression of gender categories. It is certainly no coincidence that Bobrisky's announcement prompted one of her followers to comment, "You guys look alike." Bobrisky's celebrity depends on her careful curation of categorical ambiguity, maintaining a male birth name and a male nickname, but being a woman and evading clear-cut answers to journalists' nagging questions about her gender identity. This keeps the algorithmically mediated controversy going. It is important to keep in mind that her celebrity relies not only on the fandom of friendly followers, but to a very large extent on the anti-sociality of followers who are attached to her by hatred and negative feelings. Feelings expressed not only by ordinary social media users, but also fostered by hostile content creators, such as Martin's Vincent Otze, for example. Bobrisky's latest nemesis, whose social media handle is Very Dark Black Man, has built his own brand of celebrity on performances of toxic masculinity under the guise of common sense and speaking the truth. His being a man is perhaps not coincidentally a mirror of Bobrisky's being a woman. Muscles, aggressiveness, dark-skinnedness here, fluffiness, softness, light-skinnedness there. To conclude, Bobrisky's being a woman is a unique case of gender trouble that doesn't fit too easily into conventional, read global northern or Western transgender concepts, and we shouldn't try to read it only through these. Rather, her practice is situated between this traveling model of transgenderism and its Nigerian, or rather Lagosian, context. As such, it is specifically Nigerian in several ways, both in terms of the kind of femininity and corresponding corporeal aesthetics on which Bobrisky models her gender performance, and in terms of the public outrage it generates and the way it is handled by the state and its officials. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Matthias. Next is Olalade.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is an honor to be the designated PhD student on the panel, and this is exciting. So I'm just gonna get into it. So I'd like to preface by saying Bobrisky is a trans woman. In our own words, on May 19, 2024, Bobrisky schooled the platform Instablog on the difference between trans women and cross-dressers in Nigeria, and claimed that trans women, that is who Bob is, OP have learned Instablog. And Bobrisky is also publicly and openly queer. Bobrisky is also colorist. Bobrisky is classist. Bobrisky is a queer person with internalized homophobia. Bobrisky every day troubles the state, refuses privatization, and assimilates into power and money. Bobrisky's life, while seeming untouchable and privileged, is also nonetheless fraught with risks, from the yearly readings of her birthdays to her current issues with the state. Bobrisky is patriarchy's adversary. Bobrisky troubles masculinity norms and fixed gender expressions. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This makes Bobrisky an important subject for Nigerian intersectional feminist and queer activism and scholarship. Yet, there remains an inherent complication in connecting Bobrisky's persona to the lived experience of trans women, femme men, and the general LGBT+ community in Nigeria, especially given the fact that the politics of trans activists like the late Fola Francis, who represented a politics that rejected queer, pragmatic assimilation in Nigeria. And so this brings me to reading Bobrisky as a messy signifier of Nigerian queer trouble, Nigerian gender trouble. Queer people in Nigeria have persistently formed resistant, non-public and strategically public communities of solidarity. Bobrisky also has a community as well, one that is predicated on what I read as an audition of belonging into Nollywood and the Lagos class and political elites. Bobrisky's community, however, misgenders her. Bobrisky appears in films where her life becomes a moral lesson, especially in films like Ojuloge Obirin. That was in 2015, I believe. From Bobrisky's colorism, despite appearing in a documentary by Beverly Naya that decried bleaching practices, and Bobrisky's uncritical glorification of sex work, to the broke shaming of Nigerian women for not adapting to dating Nigerian men for money, to the false advertising of vaginal tightening products and more, Bobrisky has made our queerness a celebrity spectacle, ultimately aimed at capital accumulation. So Bobrisky embodies this trans exceptionalism in Nigeria. She does not attempt to articulate activist thoughts that trouble the discrimination or marking for death of queer bodies in Nigeria. Bobrisky embodies this hegemonic feminine performance as the Mummy of Lagos, a performance of wealth and connections. And the very signifier, Mummy of Lagos, is an unattainable ideal. You can never get to Mummy of Lagos's level. It becomes in itself a controlling image of femininity in Nigeria. And the condition of being Mummy of Lagos is celebrity plus capital that allows Bobrisky inclusion into all of these halls of power that I've mentioned, from Nollywood to pop culture platforms to award shows, even religious institutions. There was a video that circulated where an imam was announcing Bobrisky Fualowo, and the pop culture scene, especially in Nigeria, is very notorious for normalizing queer-esque representation or presentation while stigmatizing the orientation. You see all of the newest male stars in Nigeria look very much like butch lesbians, and it's and you see also in August, Omaomi and Yemi Alade performed at the Global Black Pride in Atlanta in August. They have never made any statement in solidarity with queer lives in Nigeria. And so they are shielded from this blowback because of their celebrity status. Now we can infer from Jasper Boa, who has done extensive work on homonationalism in South Asia, and from observing what we see right now in real time, especially with Bobrisky's current legal troubles, that this exceptionalism, this queer and trans exceptionalism in Nigeria is always an illusion. And there's always a performance of likability. You cannot trouble the system. And so in this presentation, I want to take a step back take a direction that pulls back from the conclusions of law, conclusions of culture and religion to center the humanity of trans bodies in Nigeria. So there are trans people, trans bodies and queer bodies in Nigeria situated in a context of indigenous queer expressions. We have been talking all morning about the Yandaudu, and I wanted to spotlight Area Scatter as well, who was a trans woman in the 70s who was a civil servant in Nigeria, went into the evil forest, and came out a woman musician and was welcomed in the courts of kings across Igbo land. And when we spotlight the Yandaudu, who existed for thousands of years without discrimination and now face discrimination in contemporary Nigeria after the anti-queer legislation, despite the fact that President Goodluck Jonathan, in a statement to Oxford students in 2016, said that the SSMPA, which is the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act, was just a bill on paper to signal Nigeria's position to the global north and control the population, and that no queer person in Nigeria has been or will be arrested or thrown in jail. I find that statement very problematic because it minimizes the fear, the stigma, and the zero legal protection for queer lives. And so we come to Bobrisky, the messy signifier, whose identity is constructed at the intersection. Let's see the chat. Okay. Whose identity, is that 5 minutes more for me? Or it was in the chat before? I saw a chat.
That's from a previous chat. You've got about 7 or 8 minutes.
Okay. Bobrisky's identity constructed at the intersection of social media celebrity, of global queer advocacies, and what I like to call the hetero-nationalist projects of Nigerians. And this intersection directly influences Nigeria's gender trouble in itself, where Nigeria's gender trouble is at the intersection of global North rhetoric, or of indigenous activism, of religious conservatism, and legal pastorality. And so in this hetero-nationalist time, where to be Nigerian is to separate yourself from the influence of the people in America and Europe who are trying to corrupt our children, it is given that your sex equals your gender equals your sexuality. But gender scholars will remind us that gender is culturally coded, and gender brings the natural body into meaning based on existing cultural codes. And from the works of African feminist scholars like Ife Amadue and Oyerunke Oyewumi, we can see how within several cultures across Africa, the natural body does not always equate into the normative meaning. And gender in Africa doesn't always map onto the neatly binaries of Western gender construction. And this is especially true, I think, for us as post-colonized people, where there is a lack of endpoints for gender expression. What does it mean to be a man when you are Yoruba man plus Christian plus and so many things? You know, there's a lack of endpoints, and gender expressions are continuously products of time and power, and it becomes an imperfect category that is constantly being redefined. And this brings me to how Bobrisky has become a trans figure of trouble for Nigerian feminism, especially on Nigerian feminist Twitter. And I think it's very interesting to read this because the trans figure of trouble has replaced the queer figure of trouble that Nigerian feminists in the 70s, 80s, 90s had to contend with. And so from the works of Chiweke Oguyemi and so on, there was a spectrum of known unknown of queerness in Nigerian feminist thought. And the conclusion of Nigerian feminist scholars was to render sexuality in the realm of the private, while as we theorized our feminisms. But now in contemporary expressions where young Nigerian feminists are widely and openly and publicly and proudly accepting of queer expressions, especially when you see with NSAS, where the Feminist Coalition made a statement in solidarity with queer lives and said they have the right to express, to resist against the state based on their experiences of being queer people in Nigeria. And so the queer figure of trouble has been replaced by the trans figure of trouble. And in August, there were tensions between, especially, there are always tensions, but in August specifically, there were tensions in Nigerian feminist publics when one of the largely influential Nigerian feminists that tweeted about Bobrisky being important to Nigerian feminism. And there were so many reactions that triggered. And there is what intersectional feminists will call Nigerians radfems, who'd rejected Bobrisky as a figure that is important or otherwise to Nigerian feminists, especially, like I said before, Bobrisky has expressed very problematic statements that are anti-women. And so the radical feminist rejection of intersectional feminism that considers trans misogyny has sparked raging reactions. And something that I personally have experienced, because I made I tweeted one time about how the policing of women's bodies for authentic chromosomes and hormones, what is a woman indeed, is not far off from the racial essentialism that excluded African women from the political categories of womanhood from the 15th century. And I was doxxed violently, ragingly, and for daring to make that connection. And I feel like what you see right now as an expression of Nigerians' radical feminist expressions in digital cultures is that there is a rhetoric and moral panic and fear-mongering of the anti-gender movement that has seeped into feminist thought and has focused the attention from men who are enemies of women and focusing, and when I say men who are enemies of women, I mean, violent men, and focusing that attention on trans women who do not have material impact on the experiences of Nigerian women and all of the intersections of patriarchal and structural oppressions that they face. And yet, even beyond this defensive radical feminist rhetoric, Bobrisky's messiness also makes Bobrisky a contentious figure for even queer solidarity. Bobrisky is paradoxically homophobic, and Bobrisky's exclusion also excludes, Bobrisky's exceptionalism also excludes, it silences, it punishes, and marks others for death. When there was a news cycle where there were queer people who were arrested at a marriage, gay men were arrested at a marriage, Bobrisky had made a tweet and said, it was a very dismissive tweet, and Bobrisky is very famously homophobic. And so I believe that the spectacle of Bobrisky precludes the lived experience of trans bodies in Nigeria and encourages this hyper-focus on the body. An hyper-focus that Bobrisky herself has enabled by saying, oh, look at my surgery today, I'm going to do this. Oh, look at how good my surgeon did my boobs. Oh, look at how, and so there's an hyper-focus on the body and not on the lived experience. And so I wanted to conclude by saying, what is the lived experience of queer people in Nigeria? There's ridicule, there's Kito. Kito is the targeting on digital spaces of queer lives and lying through our dating platforms or otherwise, lying that they're also queer and they meet and then either correctively rape or kill them. And what does a queer bridging with Nigerian feminism offer us? If gender is an ongoing assignment, through cultural codes and naming logics, then I'll argue that queerness, as scholars like Katekoin have argued, is a matter of relationship with the state. It's a political project of affinity towards undoing patriarchal normativity. And so in this moment that we have anti-rights movement that are targeting both feminists, not just queer, but feminist anti-normativity, the power of self-assignment that trans bodies prompt us to, the power to say, I reject the codes, I reject this, and I'm throwing it back in patriarchy's face, and I'm reassigning myself. That power of self-assignment is something that feminists and everybody who is committed to a politics of anti-normativity can relate to. And that power of self-assignment that transness represents is important for feminist politics and thought. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Now it's time to take questions, but I'll start by asking a few questions which you absolutely do not have to respond to. So my first question is going to Rudolph. You had mentioned that people in the North seems to be offended by Bobrisky's Muslimness. And my question is whether the same thing is applicable to the ways in which people in the North see Down Dowdus, or do they see them as these other Muslims that can be kind of acceptable to the people, whereas Bobrisky, because of the ways in which she presents herself in public, so she's seen as not that kind of Muslim that we want to embrace, whereas we are happy to embrace Down Dowdus. Then for Bukola Oche, you tried to make a distinction between culture or collectivist and the notion of Western ideas. And you also situate your analysis within what you call self-expression, that Bobrisky's performance can be seen as a form of self-expression, which we all do in a variety of ways. But I wanted to ask you if you could say a little bit more about how you see culture. And I'm thinking about Professor Taiwo's presentation earlier on, where he had reminded us that culture is not a static category. It's not a fixed category. It's something that keeps changing. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. Then to Matthias, I enjoyed your presentation, and the question that I have for you about gender as performance on a day-to-day basis is whether you see Bobrisky's performance as a way of, as a way that could help us think about social mobility in society, because in most cases, Bobrisky had presented herself as someone that is just trying to climb the social ladder in society, and that women actually have better opportunity of climbing the social ladder more than men, and therefore that is why she sees herself as Mommy of Lagos, because being a woman, she's able to insert herself in all of these elitist spaces that other men may not have the opportunity of inserting themselves on. And to Ololade, I'm fascinated by your presentation. I have to say that I enjoyed it. And so I want you to maybe unpack what you mean by, trans figure of trouble that replaces trans queer of trouble. So are these two categories mutually inclusive, or are they mutually exclusive? And could you say a little bit more about what you mean by these two separate figures of troubles in Nigeria? So once again, thanks, and time to take your questions. And I don't know if you want to respond to my questions first, that is fine. But if you want us to take more questions, happy to do so.
Just a note that we have about 10 to 12 minutes for before we wrap up the panel. So we can transition to the next one.
All right, so let's take some questions then. I can read out some of the questions from our online participants. Actually, we're all online. The first is from Jamike Okoroji. In our doing and being via our language and actions as context warrants, those that claim feminine gender, does their chromosomes differ from those of their original gender, male or female? And so then there is a question for Ololade. Could you expand on where you stated that Bobrisky has internalized homophobia? Then there is a question for Bukola. Based on your research, how would you analyze collectivism within the Ubuntu framework, which is posited as Africa's communitarianism and care framework? Does Nigeria have a similar concept or ideology such as Ubuntu? All right, so who wants to go first?
Okay, I think I can.
Okay, Ololade, you want to?
Okay. For the question about the why I said, to expand more on Bobrisky's internalized homophobia. So I was making an example of in August, and this had sparked a lot of conversation among Nigerian queer publics, where in August 2023, some gay men were arrested in Delta, and Bobrisky had responded, not prompted, by the way, I don't know why Bobrisky responded, but Bobrisky had said, hey guys, I want to quickly address those sets of guys. I pasted it on the chat. I don't know if everybody can see it. And Bobrisky basically said, this class is not actually meant for everyone. And I believe you can learn from those A-list. You all deserve how you were treated. And that was Bobrisky's response. And it just connects to what we are saying about how Bobrisky is class plus capital and says, you're poor and therefore you do not deserve to be in this class, whatever that means. So that's a point of contention. And that's why I say Bobrisky is a problematic figure even for queer solidarity. And on the question of trans figure of trouble and queer figure of trouble, I think I probably should have been explicit about like the lesbian figure of trouble for Nigerian feminists in the 80s, 90s, especially because I was rereading Chiweke Ogiyemi's work and how much she tried to separate herself from womanism in terms of like Alice Walker's reading of liberation lies in women loving themselves either sexually or non-sexually. And she's saying I deviate violently from, what's the word I'm looking for? I deviate from that because I believe that sexuality is private and that should be it. And so there were a lot of tensions between young Nigerian feminists, especially with someone like Olutimi Adigbeye, who would say that in the Nigerian feminist space, she cannot find spaces because she is not just woman, but she's woman plus queer. And that queerness is not often articulated in Nigerian feminist thought. And that's why I said the queer figure of trouble versus now the trans figure of trouble, when queerness has been somewhat assimilated into like the public expressions of Nigerian feminism.
Thank you. Matthias?
I would like to answer my question on Ubuntu.
Okay, yeah, you can go.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Ubuntu is based on humanity and dignity of every human being. And so in that context, you are talking about consideration of human life, freedom, and the dignity of rights. So for us in Nigeria, I would say that we have values that evince considerations of Ubuntu, but I don't think we can, we have a name like Ubuntu. I think we actually align with the values, although I can say that in some contexts, there has been some erosion of some of our values. Unfortunately, that is where sometimes considerations of the negative aspect of individualism can be said to have come up, but not in the context of the right to expression, but when we look at considerations of greed, personal aggrandizement, and selfishness that leads to an erosion of values and norms. But I can actually say that we do have values that are similar to Ubuntu.
All right, thank you. Matthias?
Thanks for your question. Actually, I cannot answer it because that would be guesswork. I can only answer kind of something about the presentation, Bobrisky's presentation that I see on screen. And your question is was kind of asking for the motives she might have, and I find it super difficult because right now, I mean, I've been following her for a couple of years indeed, but of recent it's super difficult to kind of look back at her postings on Insta because she's deleting them now, right? Because so it's super difficult to follow that up. But even if that would be possible, I would find it super difficult to answer your question. Yeah, would be guesswork.
Thank you. Rudolph?
Oh, thank you, Prof, for your question. And thank you all my fellow panelists for your wonderful talks as well. So about the question about whether the judgments that I cited against Bobrisky are similar or different from judgments that on the basis of Islamic orthodoxy are the same as or different from Endaudu. First, I want to clarify, I don't know if I remember your language correctly, it wasn't Northern audiences generally. It's a very specific slice of kind of Muslim public teachers, right? People who are trying to be very orthodox and in their guidance to the Muslim public. That's the Taskar al-Ummah, which was one of the clips that I showed. So that's a very judgmental, narrow slice. It has a lot of power in many Northern communities, but it is not uncontested. And that, I mean, I haven't heard them, I mean, they haven't published anything about Endaudu that I've seen other than the Bobrisky, but during my fieldwork on, past and present, those same people do not approve of Endaudu. When Sharia was launched in 2000, they went after Endaudu, just like they went after quote unquote prostitutes and other people that went against their notion of Islamic orthodoxy. So they're not treating Bobrisky differently from the way they're treating Endaudu. And in fact, the similarity between Endaudu and Bobrisky in this regard is that they're all claiming to be Muslims, and then these folks will say, well, you just claim to be Muslim, but you're not a good Muslim. But they do that to other people too, right? They do it to Muslims who are deviating in ways that, according to them, that aren't having to do with gender sexuality. It could be other things as well. Like even young guys dressing like rappers might look immoral to them. And they're perfectly masculine in a normative way, but they're not obeying like Islamic norms. I did want to point out there was a comment raised by an audience member. The name I recorded is Amatala Saulawa. I don't know if I pronounced that correct, who said when I was citing the Taskar al-Ummah that they think that sometimes these Orthodox Islamic challenges to, kind of call outs about people being un-Islamic are actually a way to talk about stuff that's indecent, but almost like prurient, like get a load of these un-Islamic people. But it's almost like, why are you so fascinated with them? You're almost like promoting their indecency by calling attention to it. I mean, you see it in the United States with evangelicals going after the people that are immoral, but they get such a charge out of it that you wonder, like, why do you love to talk about the queers so much? And so I want to appreciate that comment, because what I didn't share was in some of the comment sections to those videos. Like there's another video that I don't have here where it was about butt enhancement surgery. It was where a quote unquote Endaudu, who was a Southern Nigerian cross-dresser, had gotten butt surgery to enhance her butt. And they're calling this out as so immoral. The comments, 2 comments only in Hausa, one of which, one was not Hausa, one was just smiley face with winks. And the other one said in Hausa, may God continue to make her beautiful. That's all it said, which is sort of ironic, but hardly negative.
Yeah, so one more question, and we've got about 1 minute and 30 seconds to round up. And the question is, would you say Bobrisky actually internalized homophobia? And this question is from one of our audience participants, and everyone is free to just quickly respond. 15 seconds.
Ololade seemed to say so, and I agree with her.
Yeah, Ololade, do you want to respond to?
Yeah, I already gave a response earlier about the particular example that sparked a lot of conversation within Nigerian queer publics about how Bobrisky, by saying that, was openly aligning herself with the state by saying you deserve that, and that not everybody has the class to be part of the queer community, whatever that means. And so yeah, I already gave a response in that light.
All right, Matthias, you wanted to say something?
Oh, it's just a brief question for Rudy. I noticed that Taskar al-Ummah, they wrote Dan Dauda, not Daudu. And I was thinking whether they meant Dauda, that would be dirt, right? So whether this is just would have been just a glitch or on purpose.
I think it was a mistake. I don't know for sure, obviously. I think it's a mistake because there are other videos where they actually spell it correctly, where they
okay.
Like
okay.
the one about the butt enhancement. I might have the clip somewhere, but you just take my word for it. The butt enhancement one, they spell it correctly. So I think it was just an error.
All right, thanks everyone. We've come to the end of this first panel, and please let's put our hands together virtually for all of our panelists, Ololade, Matthias, Bukola, and Rudolph. Thanks for letting me moderate this first panel. Have a good time, everyone.
Thank you, fellow colleagues. Thank you, Professor Adobe. I think we'll take it. James, how many minutes do we have to take off before we reconvene for the second panel?
I don't know if people want to take a break, but Professor Adams is here. We'll get straight into the panel.
Should we just move on straight to the next one?
I think so.
Okay.
Before people get tired and no.
Okay. Thank you. Professor Adams, over to you.
Okay, thank you. It's my honor and pleasure and duty, I suppose, to launch the second panel. So without further ado, let me please introduce the speakers. Bimbola Adelekun is Associate Professor in the Department of African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She researches Pentecostalism, performance, religion, and spirituality as they intersect with digital culture. She's the author of Powerful Devices, The Politics and Praxis of Spiritual Warfare, and Performing Power in Nigeria, Politics, Identity, and Pentecostalism. She writes a weekly column for Punch newspapers, which most of you know is Nigeria's most widely read newspaper. Oluwayinka Aromumo is an assistant professor of writing in the School of Writing, Languages, and Cultures at Millikan University, where she also directs the Writing Center. She holds a PhD in English with a specialization in composition and rhetoric from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her teaching focuses on first-year composition, writing in the disciplines, and feminist writing rhetoric in digital context. Her research interests include digital writing and rhetoric, Nigerian women's discourses in digital spaces, and African feminism. And finally, for our lineup today, Paul Ayodele Onanuga is Senior Lecturer in the Department of English and Literary Studies at the Federal University of Oye-Ekiti in Nigeria. His research interests involve around linguistic practices in new media studies, Nigerian queer sexualities, Nigerian hip-hop studies, and computer-mediated communication and discourse analysis. Some of his notable publications are Coming Out and Reaching Out, Linguistic Advocacy in Queer Nigerian Twitter, which appeared in the Journal of African Cultural Studies, and Shackling Immorality, Religious Tropes, Religious Figures, and Marginalizing Politics in Queer Nigerian Creative Text, which appeared in the Journal of African Literature Association. So with that, I will ask the first speaker to go ahead, Dr. Adelekun.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this. And the audience. Thank you for staying with us. So I have written several articles in my column about Bobrisky, and some of those matters are what I'm bringing here. But I'm trying to rephrase everything within the context of a film that was released in 2017. It was titled Daudu. And it was a story of an effeminate young man whose gender identity troubled his parent. Like most Yoruba film, Daudu is didactic. The plot is a story of a patriarch who was expecting children from his two wives at the same time. He promises that whichever of them produces a son will be offered 10 million naira. And at that time, that was like $30,000. Both women resort to supernatural means to have a son, but only one succeeds. The film moves to the future where we now see the grown-up son, Daudu, as effeminate, campy, and mimics feminine mannerisms in his way of walking and speaking. He becomes a cause of sorrow and distress for his family members who plead with and harass him to stop acting like a woman. Eventually, his family summons a babalawo, that's a diviner, who divines the problem and says that the mother at some point found that she was pregnant with a female child, but to win the huge sum of money the husband had promised, consulted another diviner who changed the child to a male in utero, and that was how they ended up with a child with an undefined gender identity. So the conundrum was resolved when a mellowed Daudu was persuaded to undergo some restorative rituals. End of story. So two things struck me throughout that film. One is the title, Daudu. It's a play on words, right? We've heard that several times today. Daudu is supposed to convey social ideas around gender. Within Yoruba culture, the title Daudu means first son. And that's the person upon whom the continuity of the lineage rests. And in a contiguous linguistic context, it also means homosexual. And in referring to the lead character of the film as Daudu throughout the story, the film plays on the ambiguity of the language to provoke the panic of a first son undermining his responsibility of the integrity of a family lineage by not manning up. Second is the endless lamentation about a Daudu acting like a woman. This is more than just acting and recognition of certain signals, as one will find in theories asserting the performativity of gender. Speakers of Yoruba language will no doubt be aware of the term used to praise a woman when she expresses valor, obirin bi okunrin, a woman like a man. To say a woman is acting like a man is to endow her with qualities of strength, bravery, and an absence of weakness and fear. To say the other way around, a man acting like a woman is hardly complimentary. That is because while masculinity is considered aspirational, femininity is a slackening of the muscularity associated with the idea of manliness. In the film, the disgust of Okunribi Obìnrin cuts into our local worldview about anatomy as a signifier of sociopolitical discourses. And so in this presentation, I want to look at the film and Nigeria's popular cross-dresser, Idris Okuneye Bobrisky, around whom the story was based, to understand the law, culture, and the prayers we make to right what is perceived as wrong with nature or a natural phenomenon. I'll probe the nexus of law and culture in our contemporary society to consider how both can collaborate to enforce prayer that insists on maintaining a normative view of the world. Both in law and religion, the term prayer registers entreaty to a source of power that can compel certain desires to happen. This force can be God, and that depends on how individual religions conceive it, or the law, which in aspect of our modern society plays the role of a sacred transcendent, or even collective society itself as not just law receivers, but also lawgivers through maintaining a value system. This last category includes filmmakers who play a crucial role in the formation of ethic, and one could see the evidence of this in the prayers applied to disambiguate gender in Daudu. In real life, and as the recent travels of Bobrisky have shown, this appeal to higher forces has become the law. Since the Bobrisky personality has refused to budge despite all the prayers offered on her behalf and against her, I am moved to ask what really fails when prayer fails. Failure in this regard is the imposition of the majority will on the individual